Good morning, all. Welcome. We're at the appointed hour, so I will call this Regional Council meeting of Thursday, May 23rd to order. Roll call. All members are present except Councillor Dillon. I see Councillor De Boer is here on behalf of Councillor Downey, who's on vacation. Councillor Fonseca has let us know she will be late. Councillor Innes is away on a personal matter. Councillor SAITO, I believe, is on her way, I think I was told, so she's just a little delayed. Councillor Starr is away on other municipal business, and all other members are present. Declarations of conflict of interest. Seeing none. Approval of the minutes from May 9. It's been moved by Councillor McFadden, seconded by Councillor Kovac. All those in favour? That is carried. Item 4, approval of the agenda. And we have a couple of added items that I'll speak to at this time. This is moved by Councillor Kovac, seconded by Councillor Groves, that the agenda for May 23, 2019 Regional Council meeting included communication from the City of Brampton regarding the Province of Ontario's 2019 Regional Government Review to be dealt with under items related to enterprise programs and services, item 14.1, and further that the agenda for the 23 May 2019 Regional Council meeting include a memo from the Commissioner of Finance and Chief Financial Officer to be dealt with under items related to enterprise programs and services, item 14.2, and further that the agenda for the May 23, 2019 Regional Council meeting include an oral update from the Commissioner of Health Services regarding a personnel matter about an identifiable individual, including municipal or local boards, to be dealt with under in-camera matters, item 22.5, and further that the agenda for May 23, 2019 Regional Council meeting be approved as amended. All those in favour? Councillor Parrish, sorry, you were on my list. Go ahead.
I think I know the answer, but Councillor Paleshi has me confused. We just had a quick meeting to ratify and bring to this body our Police Services Board choice. Is that on the agenda? No. Well, we have to add that because we just approved it.
And I think that would be appropriate. How might we achieve that, Madam Clerk?
The intention was to bring those minutes from that meeting to the June council meeting, and then at the June council meeting, it would be ratified by council.
I would suggest that we do it today and get that person trained and on the board as soon as possible. It was a unanimous agreement on the interview committee. It was a good choice. So can we put that on today?
Sure. We can put it on in
I think that's a very good idea.
camera.
So, Madam Clerk, so we are taking that as another amendment to be added to this agenda, and you will do the paperwork accordingly. Very good, Councillor Parrish. You've heard the amended agenda. All those in favour? That is carried. Thank you. Are there any public announcements at this time sponsored by a member of Council? Seeing none, Mayor Crombie.
Thank you. I do have a short announcement. On your desk, you will have a cookie from My Way Transit in Mississauga. Today is GTA Day, and we're asking everyone to perform random acts of kindness, and this is the first one to start off your day. So enjoy, and please pay it forward.
And perhaps, if I may, over to Mayor Brown. Mayor Brown and I and other members had the privilege of being in Brampton yesterday for the Christian Fellowship event and groundbreaking. Mayor Brown, you might want to bring a little bit of news about that marvelous cooperation between the federal, provincial, and regional government, please.
Yes, at the Bramley Christian Fellowship, and Pastor Randy Nielsen, as you know, was here a few months ago asking for the Region Appeals support to get affordable housing built, and because of a partnership with the federal government, the Region Appeal, and the City of Brampton, they're now starting construction on 90 affordable housing units. And as we know, it's been difficult to deal with the 7-year wait list. It's nice to see actually shovels in the ground towards affordable housing in the Region Appeal, and it wouldn't have been possible without the Region Appeal's support of that project.
Thank you. It was a real success and a nice partnership amongst all the levels of government. Okay, with that, we turn to the consent agenda. Of course, we'll be dealing with 7.1, 8.1, 8.2, and 8.3 that have to be dealt with. That brings me down to item 9.1. Hold. On to 10 and 11 items related to planning, communications. 12.1. Consent. 12.2. Consent. 12.3. Consent. Items under enterprise programs, 13.1. Consent, 13.2. Has to be held, 13.2. 13.3 has been struck, 13.4. I have consent, 13.5. Consent. 13.6. 13.7. Communications items. 14.1. Consent. I have, Madam Clerk, 14.2.
That we added that at the.
We added that.
Yeah.
I have that on consent. Very good. On to items 15 related to Public Works. 15.1. Consent. 15.2. Communications. 16.1. Consent. Items related to health. 17.1. Consent. 17.2. Very good. That brings us down to in camera, and we will have to go in camera. I don't know if we might like to dispose of certain matters that might not necessarily have to go in camera. So starting with that, 22.1 Regional Council Closed Session Report. 22.2 Report on the ROPA 30 appeals. Is it necessary that that remain in camera? So that has been dealt with on consent. 22.3 on consent. 22.4. We have to hold that one. And Madam Clerk, was there the additional one you made reference to?
Yeah, we'll hold that.
And that one's being held as well, the personnel matter that I spoke to in the added agenda. Very good. As well as Councillor Parrish's matter as well. Councillor Parrish, something further? Very good. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay, with that, we're on to delegations. Item 7.1, Mark McDonald, Partner, Government and Public Sector.
We have to actually vote on it.
Oh, sorry, of course. A recorded vote on the consent agenda. Please vote accordingly. And that carries. And with that, we're on to delegations now. 7.1, Mark McDonald, Partner, Government and Public Sector, Global Leader, Public Finance Management, Mohammed Bamani, Associate Partner, Government and Public Sector, and Mauricio Zelaya, Senior Vice President, Economics Leader, Economic Advisory of Ernst & Young, providing an overview of the Ernst & Young report related to the Provincial Review of Regional Government as requested as the May 9, 2019 Regional Council meeting. Gentlemen, welcome. And if you'd come forward.
Speak. There we go. Chair, thank you very much for the introduction. Just for clarity, Mark McDonald, Mohammed Bamani, Mauricio Zelaya. We are going to give you a presentation this morning, Chair, through you and to the Council and to the people in attendance. I'd like to start that with an introduction of the overall context and study. And that actually begins with a series of appreciations and thank yous through you again, Chair, to the Council. We understand how important this issue is. We understand the context within which the discussion is taking place. And from a professional perspective, the team is very proud to have been involved in the analysis and the work that we have conducted jointly with your officials, and quite happy to be here this morning and keen to have the conversation. The second nature, again, of that, and this would be through the broader Council, is a thank you to the regional and municipal officials who have been involved. As we will make repeated mention this morning, the steering committee comprised each of the chief administrative officers and their equivalents, and the CFOs as advisors, and then a whole series of other officials who have made the work that we present to you this morning possible. And more than just possible, we think robust and a proper analysis of the issues. And then I would be remiss to not thank both my colleagues here and the broader team that has worked exceptionally hard over the last very short period of time to present the analysis before you. The scope of the project was essentially to conduct what we're going to call a very clean financial impact of potential changes to the overall governance structure of the regional level of government and the potential implications to the lower tier municipalities. The analysis was conducted between the 26th of April and yesterday, or the 21st. It was very much a collaborative approach. And the reason I highlight that is that it was vital that it be collaborative, not just to respond to the request from council, but in fact to enable access to and understanding of all of the underlying data. And perhaps for the first time, what you have before you is what you might call an integrated analysis. That takes, as well as we could prepare, the underlying data from each of the 4 municipalities and packages it together in an analysis that is obviously fundamental to the testing of alternative scenarios. The range of assumptions that has been built, and again, I'm quite sure that we will make repeated reference to this morning, itself was a collaborative effort. It was fundamental also to the structuring of the model and the various scenarios. At the highest level, that's around the status quo scenario, around amalgamation, and around potential dissolution. But more importantly, and again, as the analysis demonstrates, those assumptions are at a service line level and potentially at a sub-service line level, so that on whole, what we have is a reasonable, fact-based reflection of potential changes and how those might have a financial impact. That leads to the presentation actually of the results themselves. Now, it is a financial impact analysis, and it is a financial impact analysis only. What that means is that it is not a service assessment. We did not get into discussion of policy choices. There are no recommendations made, and in fact, there are no predictions made about what will happen, but rather it is an analysis of what might happen under alternative scenarios and alternative assumptions. And so again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we believe this is as clean a report as we can make it of what possible futures might be, but not a prediction of what those futures will be. And then that leads, I think, to the final point, and that is that whatever happens here, further analysis is going to be required. The council, the municipal councils, are going to have to respond to whatever potential policy changes come in your direction. We believe that this analysis will help to inform that, but real decisions will have to be taken in response to whatever actually happens.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I'm just going to proceed through to our next slide, and what we're going to do for the next few minutes is talk a little bit about the process that we went through to conduct the analysis, and then we're going to discuss a little bit a high level of the results that you might have read in the report that went to the province on Tuesday. Having a steering committee was obviously a very key enabler, as Mark had mentioned, in successfully completing the analysis. The time that we had to do this analysis was quite tight. And this required a constant and a very high level of engagement with everybody involved. And so as Mark had mentioned, the steering committee was comprised of the 4 CAOs and an advisory board made up of the CFOs. And a project charter was agreed to, aligned to the steering committee terms of reference, which clearly outlined the principles by which we would collaborate on carrying out the impact analysis, of which I'll speak to in a moment. At the heart of the approach this time was to use as much data and information as possible from each of the governments. Key to this was rapid, targeted engagement with stakeholders across all the partner organizations. The graphic on this slide speaks to the level of consultation that we were able to conduct. You'll see that we had over 40 sessions, and that took place in the course of about 7 business days, with over 100 individuals across all the major organizational functions from each of the partners. The ability to conduct this much outreach in such a short amount of time is only possible, again, with the full and complete cooperation and commitment of the staff and all of your organizations. And I do want to recognize our project logistics coordinator, Angela McLean, who was able to rally the troops in rapid succession when needed, with little choice as to when anybody had to be in a room in order to be able to participate. So we thank her for that. They were able to mobilize unbelievably fast, and we thank them and we commend all the staff and all the organizations in doing that. Sorry. The overall approach is outlined here. It was really to focus the analysis in the areas of your business that have the most impact and are most material to your operations and to your residents. To do this, our team worked with the steering committee members to identify all the services that are provided in each of your organizations, develop a number of service categories, and go through the meticulous mapping of data and information that your organizations collect to those categories so we could identify what is actually the most material that really needs that in-depth analysis. With that list of in-scope services in hand, we worked with the members of the steering committee to identify each of the options for analysis for each service within amalgamation and dissolution. Scenarios and conducted those aforementioned interviews, workshops with staff across the partners, collected files upon files of data and information, and set about to review and assess all of it to truly understand the many intricacies of the businesses that you currently manage. Knowing the uniqueness of the business, we had 2 specialized subcontractors that also worked with us through the study for specific insights. That's Hicks Morley for when it came to labor law and other case law precedents, and Hemson Consulting to advise the team when it came to development charges impacts. The key to all of this was to develop a series of assumptions that would allow us to consider what the impacts would be related to each of the options under each of the scenarios. Based on our analysis of data, research, and interviews, we brought those to the steering committee, a series of assumptions to gain their consensus on the analysis. This became a key, very important function of the steering committee. Important for everyone to have agreement and consensus on each and every assumption to ensure agreement and legitimacy of the data and the analysis that we were conducting. Each and every assumption was discussed, debated, and eventually signed off by each and every member of the steering committee. There were a number of instances where we engaged in admittedly a healthy debate related to our research, to different options, to feasibility of those options, and where consensus could not be reached, multiple options and assumptions were modeled, and you will see the output of that as we go through. We met with the steering committee 10 times over the last 3 weeks in 3-hour workshops to come to agreement on everything. And again, I must commend your senior leaders in your organization for the relentless commitment to having been present for this analysis. There was a culture of deep respect and collaboration among all of them, making working with each of them a pleasure. The results of these sessions, analysis and research, fed into a complex and sophisticated financial model that would allow us to identify the financial impact of these different scenarios. And I'll ask my colleague Maurizio to take you through the model right now.
Okay, thank you very much. So this slide will be describing the conceptual framework of the financial model that was developed to calculate the financial impacts under amalgamation and dissolution. So at a high level, this model estimates the incremental financial costs or savings of both the amalgamation and dissolution scenario relative to the status quo or the current state, while also providing a relevant financial outputs for each municipality and the new amalgamated entity. Specifically, moving from left to right in the conceptual slide above, the inputs into the financial model was a combination of many things. Source data from each of the municipalities, which includes historical and forecasted capital budget plans, operational spending and forecasts, in addition to detailed employee information. There was also primary research and analysis conducted, as my colleague Mohammed had mentioned, involved a series of discussions with well over 100 stakeholders. And more so, secondary information. This would refer to as benchmark studies of previous amalgamation of municipalities that have occurred. So we had researched what had occurred, such as from the City of Toronto and the City of Hamilton, with also discussions from those stakeholders that have underwent amalgamation at Haldimand and Norfolk. So the combination of the above serves as inputs to begin developing the functionality of this model. To do so, the first step really includes developing the current state of each municipality and standardizing that large volume of information received and categorizing the information into service areas to identify and calculate its cost drivers, its capital spend, and its annual spending. So the first step is critical in developing a current state to which to compare the scenarios of amalgamation dissolution. The steering committee was instrumental in providing guidance that this calculation was done correctly. The second step is now to identify the service areas that are likely to be impacted by amalgamation dissolution. Working together with the steering committee, we work closely to identify which service areas should be under consideration. And lastly, the third step is identifying a set of options that may occur for each service area under each scenario. So as an example, when we looked at human and social services, they would not be impacted under amalgamation as this is a service provided by the region. Whereas under dissolution, each municipality would be providing this service locally as opposed to the region. Combining steps 1 through 3 with over 200 plus approved assumptions, the financial model calculates the costs and the efficiencies relative to the status quo for each service line and municipality, calculates financial metrics, and the balance sheets and perform a net cost of service operating costs under dissolution, accounting for the allocation of Peel-owned assets and debt while providing other information as it relates to adjusted FTEs. So this is at a very high level. So I'll now pass it back to Mo to describe what the outcome of this model was.
So, as you've heard, there was a lot of work that happened and a lot of data and a lot of series of options and assumptions. And if I went through each of them, we'd be here for another 3.5 weeks. So I will just provide quickly the very high level summary of findings here, and then we can open it up to questions. There are another few areas that we want to go into a little bit of detail of explanation, but you've seen the public report that we've done where some of those details are. In terms of the total cost of amalgamation, cumulatively, there's a cumulative cost of amalgamation of 13 to 576 million, or 0 to 2.2% of the total status quo, which is what happens right now, net cost of service, and that is through to 2028, which was the period of our review. That annualized amounts to a decrease of 11 million to an increase of 49 million, or 0.4% to 1.8% annualized cost of service, net cost of service. All capital and debt, in the case of an amalgamation, would be transferred to the new municipal entity. When it comes to dissolution, the cumulative cost would be between $16 and $655 million, or nearly 0 to 2.5% of total status quo net cost of service, again, over that period to 2028. Annualized, that's a decrease of 6 million to an increase of 61 million, which is, again, about 0 to 2.2% annualized. Much of this is driven by a number of the different drivers and the different assumptions that went into the analysis, the largest one being the treatment for Peel Regional Police, and we'll speak about that in just a moment. What that means in terms of debt and capital is that there would be a split of the capital and the assets that are currently owned and managed by the region of Peel to each of the municipalities. And what you see here on this slide is what the outcome of that split is. For Brampton, it's a gain of $7.4 billion in capital assets, accompanied with debt of $749 million. Caledon, $2 billion in capital assets and $71 million in debt. And for Mississauga, it's $8.8 billion in capital assets and $1.1 billion in debt. And this is largely driven by roads, other public works, and the social housing portfolio that is currently owned by the region. A few areas that we did want to call out specifically. The first one is really around the police dissolution model. So there were obviously a number of options that we could have considered with respect to the treatment of this. We went forward in consultation with the steering committee to model two possible models in dissolution, one in which there would continue to be a joint Peel Regional Police Services Board, and the other being that there would be separate boards for Brampton and Mississauga. And in both of those cases, while in the body of the report we model some things around Caledon. In both of these ones that I'm presenting here, Caledon is still serviced by the OPP. So what you'll see here is that the net cost of service in 2022, and we've identified 2022 as the time when the assumption is that the dissolution would be absolutely complete. It would be completely separated at that point, is that the net cost of service in a joint board would be $461 million annually, and in separate boards, the range is from $501 million to $514 million. So the difference in costs between separate boards and having a joint board would be between $39 and $53 million annually. Further to that is a discussion about how you actually allocate the costs between the two municipalities in both situations. And there were two allocation methods that we as a steering committee agreed to model. One is based on current impact assessment values, which is how the allocation of costs currently takes place. The other is driven by the current model that the OPP uses in billing municipalities for their services, and that is to use the 50% of the allocation is related to property counts, and 50% of the cost is related to calls for service. So when we conduct, pardon? And time, sorry, the cost, the number of calls and the associated time for each one of those services. So we conducted that model, and what you see as you go from the center to the right of the slide is what the impact of that is. So starting if we continued with a joint board model, under the impact scenario, which is what happens right now, the net cost of service that's attributed to Brampton is $170 million, and for Mississauga it's $278. When you move to a slightly different model with different drivers, you have an increase to the cost of Brampton of $67 million and a corresponding decrease to Mississauga of $67 million. If we were to look at the separate boards in that separation, and under impact, the costs are $185 to $190 for Brampton, and $303 to $311 for Mississauga, and then that would move for Brampton to an increase in the weighted average cost model of $73 to $75 million, and the corresponding decrease for Mississauga. These are both legitimate and agreed to upon models that should be considered as to the possible cost implications, and what model actually happens in the future in either of these cases would be determined at that time. But these are the options and what they would look like.
Okay, thank you very much. So now moving on to the tax analysis component. So here what we reviewed was now under a dissolution structure, really comparing what the status quo was pre-dissolution, and then comparing the status quo or post-dissolution as of 2022, and compare what the net costs of that would be. And we could be able to quantify that and provide it in terms of a tax burden, so to speak. And so the steps here in calculating this was simplistic in the conceptual side of things, but very complicated as we got into it. And the idea here is we first start with the pre-dissolution mechanism, where we think about what the current state is at the moment. We understand what's being contributed to the region of Peel to be able to make those adjustments in terms of that additional cost of service. And then we look at the post-dissolution, once you have allocated where they receive those assets and the debt, the assets, and both the operational costs has changed, and we compare those two values. And this is what we have come up here with. And so the idea here is now this is a range, and the range is really driven by the underlying assumptions, and those underlying assumptions is based on those options under policing, whether it's a separate board or a joint board, and using both the extreme cases of what the cost would be for each of them, on both on the lower end and on the higher end. And so we see here that for Brampton, it could range from savings of $45 million to a cost of $33 million annually. For Caledon, we see a cost that ranges from roughly 20 to 23 million, and notice that this is slightly a tighter range precisely because under both options for the policing model, they were just contracting to OPP, and so that's why you see this a little bit tighter. Whereas Mississauga, we see a larger range between 84 million to a cost of 20 million annually. Now notice that I've actually have asterisks on the 33, the 23, and the 28 million. That represents actually the next slide, which is this modeling of the development charges on where they should be allocated or not. And so to really understand that range that we provided, it's actually the lowest of the low and also the highest of the high. So including the development charge, including the highest cost option for the police board, and the more aggressive or what I would say is the more costly assumptions across the service lines. Okay, so moving on to the dissolution or development charges. EY was asked to assess the tax. Oh, sorry. So the main question here. So moving on to the next slide. EY was retained by we subcontracted Hemson Consulting to provide development charge advice on the potential financial implications, moving from the current two-tier governance model to the amalgamation or dissolution governance model. So here the main question is whether a change in the current two-tier municipal governance model would impact the ability for municipalities to collect DCs for growth-related capital costs going forward. So we do note, though, that there was a similar analysis that was conducted by the Region of Peel on a report entitled Financial Implications of Transfer of Jurisdictional Financial Responsibility for Regional Roads, long title, what we refer to as a 2017 report. And so this 2017 report was presented to Region of Peel Council on June 6, 2017, and approved on June 22nd, 2019. We're bringing this up because there's actually two differences in opinions on the development charges from what we have found from our subcontractor Hemson and for what was approved or described or found in the 2017 report. And the opinions really differ on the ability for municipalities to collect these development charges. And again, to restate that Hemson viewed that there would be no impact on the ability to collect DCs, whereas in the 2017 report, they found that it may have a cumulative impact to municipalities of approximately 110.8 million over the course to 2028. So given the modeling assumptions, we actually modeled both into our assessment. So the steering committee agreed to review Hemson's findings and the 2017 report, and we present these here below in the table. And so we find that using the Hemson's findings of no change to development charges, then the total cost of dissolution up to 2028 would be 655 million. And using the 2017 outcome of 11.2 million annually, or to 2028, which is 110.8 million, the cost would be upwards of 755.8 million. So here we would also like to note that the analysis of development charges does not consider the impact of Bill 108. So the More Homes, More Choice Act, so which was passed on May 2nd, 2019. So we just like to be clear there. Okay.
So that said, that brings us to the end of our presentation, and we're happy to take questions.
And thank you. And the only thing that I have is in receiving the data, our staff's put together a compilation just in one sheet of what all the moving parts speak to. And I don't want a presentation, but if the CFO could just put up the slide to say, here's how we see all of the moving parts. If you could just put that up before I go to my long list of questioners. Stephen?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, members of Council. Well, and I'm sure one of the questions that everybody will be asking and thinking about and probably wanting to ask EY is, why are your numbers different than Deloitte's numbers? And I don't think it would be fair for EY to comment on the methodology applied by Deloitte. So this slide hopefully will help assist Council's understanding of the two different sets of numbers. First, different results are expected when different assumptions, methodologies, and scenarios are used, and that's, I think, what the team from EY just explained. Second, before I explain the details, I want to note that at a high level, the differences to note, there's two different particular issues to highlight here. Ernst & Young used 2018 dollars with no inflation. Deloitte used a 1.9% inflationary index per year, resulting in higher net cost increases. Ernst & Young assumed the base year was a status quo year in their methodology, so the next 9 years had cost increases, cumulative cost increases. In Deloitte's work, they assumed the cost increases would start in year 1, so in effect there was 10 years of cost increases in their numbers. With respect to the amalgamation side of the slide, Ernst & Young's high cost is essentially the same as Deloitte results after you factor out the inflationary impact. However, they did use different assumptions in modeling, but produced a similar result. With respect to their low-end cost, and you'll have questions for EY to explain the details of that, their different assumptions in modeling provided a range, as they've described, and they'd be more than pleased to provide the examples of what drove those differences. With respect to dissolution, Ernst & Young used different assumptions again than Deloitte. However, under dissolution, their net costs remain higher than status quo. The Ernst & Young higher scenario is lower than Deloitte's, primarily as it relates to different assumptions around waste management. For the Ernst & Young low, they modeled, again, different scenarios like peel police and development charges, as they just explained, which drove down their low range of cost increases. Under both amalgamation and dissolution, you can see from this chart, the Ernst & Young high results are very similar to the Deloitte results. Both Ernst & Young and Deloitte confirmed that it is likely that there is higher net cost for amalgamation and dissolution as shown compared to the status quo on this slide. Thank you, and I'll return you back to Ernst & Young for questions and answers.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of order.
Madam, Councillor Parrish, yes.
Were the Ernst & Young people aware that that presentation was going to be made?
Yes, they were, but I'll let them answer.
And would you give them an opportunity to comment on it if they choose to?
By all means,
you.
absolutely.
I think I would just repeat what has been said, that there were different bases for the report. As we've outlined, we went very much to a set of underlying data, built it up, and a whole series of assumptions, service line by service line, ranges, and so forth. And so I think primarily it reflects different approaches.
But the approaches you used were signed off by all 4 bodies?
Correct.
And agreed to?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I will go to my list for questions at this time. Mayor Crombie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, congratulations. I think that was a monumental feat which you pulled off in, 3 weeks, considering the timelines and the agreement with all parties. And I want to also thank my staff, some of them I see in the audience, who were very quick to respond, and I think you'll agree that they were there with all the numbers as soon as you asked. So I want to commend them and thank them. Janice Baker's here, Kent is here as well, so they did a fantastic job in their team, so I want to thank you. It paints a different picture than what we saw with Deloitte, for sure, based on different assumptions, and you know that most of us here didn't agree with the fundamental underlying assumptions. But now we have the facts all on the table, so we're very, very delighted about that. And it's interesting that your analysis corroborates our internal numbers, which I was very pleased they came down to the nickel of $84 million in savings. I mean, that's how great our staff are. They could be working for you at Deloitte. Gary, you're not going anywhere. But so we're very, very pleased that you corroborated that number. Because I think that, Mississauga feels very strongly that all costs can be managed, and some of the costs that you describe are worst-case scenarios, and that we know that they can be managed. So I think there's agreement with everyone in this room that there's one thing we don't want, and that's the amalgamation scenario. So we're working on different goals here, but I think that's one thing we all agree on. Yes, I've got questions. I have a little opening. Is that okay, Councillor Palashi? To Stephen VANOFWEGEN, you put the chart up, and you said a lot of the differences were in some of the assumptions. And the one on the waste management, the reason there were different numbers, the assumption there was there would be a high penalty in a contract cancellation, if I'm not mistaken. And when Deloitte looked at those contracts, they found out that there would not be any penalty. If you could please confirm that that be the case. Or there wouldn't be a penalty because we could let those contracts naturally expire before we renegotiate it. Could I have both of you confirm that, please?
Yes, so we actually reviewed well over 2,000 contracts that range from many different areas, from basic procurement to, yes, wastewater management to, yes, to quite a large degree. And we were fundamentally looking for two components, termination costs and transfer of ownership costs. And a lot of them were related to SAP IT implementation, which was largely immaterial in a grand scheme of these numbers. When you look for any type of waste management, there were some that were some penalties, but it was largely maybe at most in the hundreds of thousands. It wasn't very much. And often as we're looking where there would be some cost in termination or transfer of ownerships, it was also likely the case based on the agreement that they would it's best to let it expire.
Correct.
And so that's how we came about that. It was
So
largely immaterial.
that, for E&Y, that was the difference between the other, largely some of the differences in the costs. And you confirmed that you've looked to, E&Y's looked through all those contracts, and that wouldn't have been the case. So it was another one of those false assumptions. Also, on the Deloitte study, they included inflation, which really isn't impacted by the change. And why did you not include the inflation numbers?
Yep. So we did everything in 2018 real dollars.
In real dollars.
So that was just primarily, we were very clear on that. So going forward, the idea there is any changes over time would be based on the assumptions that were agreed upon with the steering committee, which is largely changes in the operational business.
Great. I just want to talk to you about the approach you took for the report and then number of people you met in the steering committee, the stakeholder meetings. And if you want to talk a little bit, and you mentioned it, the collaboration that was involved in putting this together with really 4 levels of government in a very tight time frame.
Sure. We were actually just lamenting this morning. Mark and I have worked together for 15 years doing public sector consulting, and we don't remember a time when we've had an engagement where we had essentially 4 different organizations that we were trying to report to. So this is a very unique situation. And I would say that the commitment to collaboration amongst the 4 CAOs and the CFOs that were advising them was absolutely fantastic and critical to making this actually happen. And that extended clearly to the staff in each of your organizations. It was very clear the importance of this piece of work and the importance of everybody to be involved and ready to go, particularly in the timelines that we had. That message came directly from the CAOs and the CFOs. So when we would, on a Thursday afternoon, ask to meet on a Friday morning, everybody would be in that room ready to go. And trust us, in our experience, that does not happen with any kind of regularity. So it was absolutely critical to making this happen.
It just shows you the professionalism of all 4 organizations, quite frankly. And I was always also delighted because I did hear that E&Y said that all 4 organizations are extremely well run and very efficiently run as well. So thank you for that. And I know that to be true as well. So also wanted to ask about the data you received and if you were satisfied with the amount of data and that you received, and were you confident that you could draw your conclusions from the data that you received from the 4 municipalities?
Yes. We received all of the budget. We received all of the forecasts that are integral to the underlying plans. And yes, satisfied.
Well, it was interesting how you say it was such a collaborative approach and having all the voices at one table. It was very interesting. Did all 4 CAOs sign off on the report before it was given to the province?
Yes.
So you have agreement on that. I wanted to ask a question about compensation. I didn't see anything on compensation in the report. There is some misinformation out there that for some reason, like in any, should there be a divorce scenario, there'd be a big severance package. Did you come to any conclusion that Mississauga would need to compensate any municipality in the event of a dissolution, in particular to the Cumming principle?
Yeah, so the Cumming principle is one where access to the benefit of ongoing service and/or asset is the point that is in question. There are precedents that the definition of that benefit needs to be considered and potentially arbitrated as it relates to the continuance of that benefit and any compensation that would be in question. So again, we've sought some counsel from Hicks Morley around some of the case law associated with that. The way that it was modeled in the approach was to identify as much as possible the service models that would in fact continue to enable access to the status quo level of service. And so on that hand, we believe that the analysis indicates a situation where the maintenance of benefit is in fact assumed to be in place as long as possible. The actual identification of a future series of events that might take place, we have not predicted, and therefore the specific outcome that might happen, I'm using words here quite carefully, but that might happen would need to be the subject of further review and explanation.
Well, from my understanding, based on the Cumming principle, that if the benefit of the asset stays with the taxpayer, then there is no compensation to be paid. Can you confirm that?
That is our understanding of the principle, yes.
Very good. That makes me very happy. Finally, because I know we have all kinds of questions to be asked, we got a big row, so I'll just ask one more. On page, I think it was 23, you provided a range of costs over 10 years in the event of a dissolution. What was that range and what were the drivers for that amount?
Yeah, well, I mean, a whole series of assumptions, service line by service line, that talk about the potential ranges. And so again, I mean, the highlight of the case that we've established or that we presented this morning around police is but one of those examples.
Right.
And in fact, there is that for every one of the key service lines for internal services, for housing, for all of the dimensions of the service lines. And the range then represents the cumulative total at both, let's call it the lower end, and at the upper end of those bounds, and that's associated with that. I would make a point that there are also one-time transition costs that have been modeled. It's not on page 23, but rather on page 25. Under both scenarios, you would have a series of things to manage over a transition period. That transition period has been assumed to be a 2-year period. And so those transition costs would be borne during that period, but then not borne after that.
Correct.
And so the ongoing change to the net cost of service is what's reflected
in
on page 23.
Mississauga's case, it was about $40 million, which would be more than compensated for in the $84 million in savings that we would realize. On the answer to the question on the drivers and the range was about $600 million, which I found very instructive as well, because it's quite a wide variation from the results of the other report that had been conducted. So I want to thank you. Thank you for the analysis, and great job. I'll move on.
Thank you, Mayor Crombie. There was a question pending, I think, through to Stephen, though, about the dissolution and the penalties with regards to waste. I thought you asked it of both of them. Stephen, or did somebody from staff, if that question is still pending, why was it that no penalties were considered as it related to the dissolution of waste contract? I thought the mayor offered an opportunity.
Because the contracts didn't allow for it.
Yeah, and you asked quite fairly, and if staff wanted an opportunity to speak to that. Yes, Madam Mayor, thank you.
Well, I can't speak on behalf of Deloitte's review, but through their review and their interpretation of the contracts, and they did have the contracts, their interpretation was that there would be termination costs.
Unless, of course, the contracts were allowed to expire naturally. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I go with my list, I want to thank Mayor Crombie. I want to be very clear to all my colleagues going forward. Very unusual situation in that, as you know, because of a whole process foisted upon us by the province, this wasn't our idea. Deadlines foisted upon us by the province, not our idea. Deadlines that have come and gone, so we had the report to them. My analogy is the exams are written and only one guy's marking them, the premier. So in point of fact, there aren't many motions you can make before me today, and yet it's such an important issue that I think the questions have to be asked and the comments have to be made. Madam Crombie, you were very respectful in following that general format. I allow it to everyone else, knowing that there won't be a resolution before the chair. The matter's been dealt with, and yet it's so important that I think the conversation is worth having. And I mean it. Mayor Crombie started us off on the right foot. I welcome similar respectful comments, questions of any kind from anybody else on such an important matter. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mayor Thompson.
Thank you, and I'm going to echo, I have some questions, but I want to echo what Mayor Crombie did say, and I'm sure the other mayor as well. I want to thank you for cramming so quick to get a school project, as you say, done in the 11th hour and having it delivered on time for the teacher to market, and to me it's an A for that. But to do it in the short time frame, bringing everything together, and I'm not so sure, Mr. Chairman, if it wasn't for the Deloitte report, it was the catalyst to get what we needed here today. And I think everything happens for a reason, and I think we've really come with a really good outcome. The one thing I guess I want to ask is, and honing in the numbers, especially with Caledon's had a significant amount of growth and it's going to continue with more growth. A lot of it is always assessed on residential numbers. I'm just saying the industrial commercial tax base is something that we're definitely lacking, that we are going to grow extremely aggressively in the next little while. Was that factored in on your numbers, or did you have information to be able to work with that?
I mean, my first comment would be to thank you for your comments, but then to once again recognize that that was a joint team effort, not just with our team, who again did a phenomenal job, but also with the various municipal teams. So thank you again for that. The analysis relies on all of the information that is in your current forecasts, and so to the extent that that reflects that specific issue, the answer is yes.
Thank you. The one thing too is your high analysis on costs. The reason for hitting that high, I know it's with all the contracts pending, but is that also giving the quality of life for the residents of Region Appeal? Your lower numbers would probably be dropped in services that people enjoy today.
Let me put it to you this way: the assumption that has been taken throughout is that there would be a maintenance of the existing service lines. And so each of the individual service areas that have been considered have taken as a principle that there would be no diminution of service levels. And that is reflected then in the various cost assumptions that have been modeled.
So would that be the higher cost?
Yeah, this was not an explicit service review. And in fact, one of the things that we do highlight in the section around the requirement for further analysis is that should an event happen that requires you to actually deal with some of these issues, in this case it would be a recommendation, would be to absolutely focus on not just service levels, but issues of efficiency, of economy, of equity, and so forth, in any response. And so again, we make that very, very clear in the report.
Okay. Well, to sum up, I want to say I see our CFO and our CEO, and I know the others are all sitting here from Brampton and Mississauga as well, and I want to say thank you to everybody working together to get this report. And I do believe this is a really good document. It doesn't matter what budget we go through, if it's at our lower tier municipality or at the region for the next 10 years. Hopefully, in my opinion, that the status quo remains as such, because I think it really explains this well, and especially concerning Caledon. But I think it gives us a really good work plan to, or a good some good fundamentals here to go forward with our budgeting and our fiscal responsibility going forward. So over that 10-year phase, I think we've really got a snapshot in time for hard data that is going to give us something to work with going forward. Sure, there's always factors that come in and change things, but I want to thank you for that, because I really think at the end of the day, this document is going to be a living document going forward, and a job well done in a short time frame. And again, I thank everybody for doing this. And I guess I lost the train of thought. I had one other question, but I can't remember what it was. But thank you very much for everybody's work on this.
Thank you. Councillor SAITO.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. And, you know, looking at two different firms sitting here, it's kind of like putting two lawyers side by side, right? Maybe we should have a barrier between you. You're working very well together. I want to also, first of all, I want to preface my questions with thanking the staff of all of the municipalities. I know how hard our staff worked, and I'm sure that in the other, here at the region, our staff here at the region worked equally as hard, and I'm sure Brampton and Caledon staff were under the same, they were under the same pressures as ours were. So I think we all appreciate this. I couldn't help but think when I read the report that I wish we had done this back in February, that we had gotten together as a council and had a joint report with everyone working together, because then we wouldn't be sitting here with two different consultants and two different assumptions and two different reports. So maybe going forward, hopefully we'll never see anything like this again facing us, but if we ever do, I would hope that we would keep that in mind and work together as a team rather than individually. We're all going to be parochial, we know that, and I would expect no less of my colleagues on the other municipalities as well, but as long as we work together and respect each other, that's what really counts. Would you mind putting up slide 7? Because we do not, it's the one with Peel Regional Police, we don't have it in the printed copy here. Thank you.
And Councillor SAITO, you still have the floor. The clerk's just advised me, she made the note to your very point. Councillors did not have all of the ENY slides ahead of time. We will provide the slides. So if there's something that I'm just being learned is awry, thank you.
This one, it would
and
be
I
good to
apologize.
have. Yes. Yeah. And I realize that, and I think we all understand that you were under a great pressure. We understand that it was, 20 minutes before the deadline to get it to the province when it was finally approved. So the fact that there may be some slides that we don't have here, I think is quite understandable. But this one, I think is very important because it has been an issue, and Mayor Brown has raised the issue of the separate police services if there was dissolution. And I think it's important that we look at how those numbers would fall out. So I appreciate you did both of the scenarios with using MPAC, which is what we do today, and using the 50-50 that the OPP use. So is my assumption correct that today we're paying Mississauga, by 222, it's 278 million. If we use the 50-50, we would be paying 67 million less if we use a different scenario. And that, I know that's under a joint board, so I'm looking at that right up.
Based on all of the various assumptions and so forth, yes.
Okay, so I guess for us, and I don't, when you came out to the 84 million at the end, did that include 67 million for policing, saving on dissolution?
The range of options is incorporated, yes.
It is incorporated, okay.
And the way that it's presented there on page 7 is at the end of the transition period.
Right.
So it's a 2022 number.
Right, because you're going to have all of those transitions. Okay, so.
I should also say that, and Mohammed definitely mentioned this, but that there is a dimension here again of making sure that that option would reflect whatever provincial policy is in play as well.
Right, okay, all right, and of course they always have the final say. So under separate boards, the saving to Mississauga, and again, if there's a saving to Mississauga, there's going to be a cost to Brampton because of the amount that we're paying over. So the 73 million saving to Mississauga, is that based on the 50-50 being in place, or is that a range of either one? I just wasn't clear where that 73 was.
Yeah, the underlying set of assumptions on the change to the cost of service are driven by the various changes in parameters that would go into the provision of the service.
So the 50/50 would see the 70, on
Well,
the
the
bottom
range
one.
between 501 and 514 reflects the underlying conditions of the cost of service, so that's the first step there.
Okay,
And then
sorry,
the
you didn't
second
get me
step
clear.
is, were you to go through alternative funding models of that,
Right.
the comparison is between MPAC and the weighted average cost, and that is the difference there between the 73 and the 75 in that range.
Okay, so at the top, if we were to go today, all right, yeah, I'm getting it now. Okay.
Right.
I'm doing my
So were you to
arithmetic
go
now.
to separate boards,
Right.
the cost of service would actually increase for
Right,
both.
from
But
461 to
then,
501.
that's exactly right. And then you
Okay.
talk about the funding of that, which has an impact on who pays for what.
Okay, so if we left everything the way it was, if we had separate boards, Mississauga would go from 278 to 303 under a separate board scenario.
At the lower end, 311 at
The
the
lower
upper
end.
Yeah.
And Brampton would go from 170 today to 185.
To
So roughly
185.
10 to 15 million dollars. If everything stayed the same with separate boards, it would be that amount of a difference. Okay. Okay. Because I know I think part of the concern was that the difference would be many more millions than, 15 million's a lot of money. But I think it really makes it clear to us that, looking at those two scenarios, that it's not quite as bad as might have been predicted before we saw those numbers. So thank you. I think our residents probably aren't too happy to know that they're paying 67 million more for policing today, based on the MPAC model, and that if we went to a different model, the same with the OPP, the service model, that we would even be saving money. So thank you very much, and thank you to Deloitte as well. You were under pressure for your report. Unfortunately, we didn't get an opportunity to provide input or have our staff at the municipalities provide any input or data. So I understand how difficult it must have been. So thank you both.
Thank you, Councillor Saito. Councillor Raz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the report and presentation. I think it was it helped solidify some of the thoughts that we had yesterday, and we spoke about it as a council at our city council. And I guess when it comes to the executive summary piece, can you clarify the conclusion for council, which is, if Mississauga has a range of up to $84 million, does that start in 2022 as cost savings going forward?
Yeah, and I might start that it is reflective of a whole series of assumptions and events that would have to take place. And the way that we have reported it is at the end of transition. That could be the difference, but again, it would be contingent on a whole series of events like the one that we have just discussed. Okay. So I think that you need to take it in the context of, in fact, the potential range of what the impact might be.
And it looks like the biggest impact on the savings, at least for Mississauga taxpayers, will be how the police board ends up forming.
The single largest variable in the analysis is that, yes,
Okay.
on that particular issue.
Thank you. On development charges, you touched on it in your presentation, and I didn't see too much of it in the report yesterday. I may have missed it. Can you confirm with certainty that there will be an impact upon DC upon dissolution?
So as we mentioned during our presentation, we had engaged Hemson Consulting to come in and do that analysis. Their view was that there would be no impact to development charges in this scenario. There was, however, the 2017 roads report, as you often refer to it, that had a different treatment in which identified a cumulative, and I'll just go to the number here, a cumulative impact of 110 million over that period that goes to 2028. So they are two different assumptions, and we've modeled both of them.
Okay. Does E&Y personally support one model or the other, or they're just completely different models?
They're just completely different models.
Okay, thank you for that. Interesting that I know we're in a state now where Bill 108 is probably going to completely change our business, so it's almost a moot point. If that goes forward, we're going to be having different conversations in just a couple of months. When it comes to the tax analysis impact, can you explain how this was done and how the ranges were arrived at? I think was that slide 8? I don't have the slide deck in front of me.
Okay, so the way it was calculated was looking at the pre-dissolution status quo and comparing it to the post-dissolution status quo and really netting out those incremental cost savings from those to arrive at this annual cost or savings that you would see here. And so the only adjustment we have from the status quo is understanding what those contributions are to Peel for the services they provide and be able to allocate that so we can properly compare apples to apples, right? And so the idea there is if you're paying for certain services for the region, we'd use a methodological assumption to allocate those costs and be able to then understand, well, under certain scenarios or under certain options, what that incrementality is, and then that's how you would arrive at this tax burden number.
Okay, quick question on the Brampton savings. Given if the bulk of the savings for Mississauga are based on an addition for the Peel Police Board models, would that not have a bigger impact on the savings to Brampton to the negative?
So the way we should interpret this is actually a collection of assumptions at the lower range. So it's not necessarily that if we look at the lower range, it all adds up into the math, because each municipality has very specific businesses and how that would work under dissolution and amalgamation. So it's really understanding the set of assumptions under the lowest of those ranges and then be able to accumulate that. So this is a global range and not necessarily representative of a certain scenario for police, but it's underlying other factors as well, although we do recognize that police is one of the major factors.
Okay. All right. Thank you to your team and certainly the municipal teams that worked on this. I think one of the things that I said at one of the last council meetings is that the report's going to be the report, and you're going to have to like it. So we do. Now, we can read a lot into it, and we're all going to with our individual lenses, but it was a good report. Thank you.
Well said, and thank you, Councillor Raz. Councillor Parrish.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm more impressed with your presentation than I was with what we read yesterday. You guys aren't exactly literary smoothies. That was really tough, and I don't speak number, so I was having one hell of a time, but it's much better today. You state that Mississauga will be allocated $8.8 billion in capital assets and $1 billion in debt under dissolution. Can you confirm for council that those assets are broadly driven by water and wastewater, which is already in existence and we've already been dealing with it?
No, water and wastewater that's part of it. Another significant part is actually housing. So when we take all the housing units that are owned by the region and by Peel Living, and we allocate those according to geography, that's one of the drivers as well.
And they eventually pay themselves off with mortgages, though?
Yeah.
Okay, and the water and wastewater, those assets are right at the lake, so they're not going to move?
No, but the model, and correct me if I'm wrong, the model that we modeled with respect to water and wastewater would be that would become a joint utility board. And so the assets would actually move to that joint utility board, and with the municipalities all having ownership of that board. And so the allocation of those assets is based on the ownership structure of
and that's a reality that we all recognize. I don't think anybody would argue with
correct.
that.
That was the agreed upon option, that there was no scenario that the CAOs or the CFOs saw where you could actually,
divide that up.
Right, correct.
Okay. I note in the report there's no tax ratio analysis, yet we were told that you did a little bit of it. Can you confirm that in amalgamation, Mississauga residents will pay more in taxes?
So we actually did conduct a tax ratio harmonization exercise. This was largely given by the steps provided by Hempson. They provide, and we had done the calculation. We had worked very closely with representatives from the municipalities to understand that exercise. But what we did do is we actually only calculated and we presented in the report the total tax class shifts among property classes and not necessarily within each municipality.
We were told yesterday that our staff calculated that all our property homeowners would increase by $459. Does that make sense to you?
I would have to see the exercise to comment.
Would you agree that they will increase?
I cannot comment on that.
Okay. You state that under a dissolution scenario, one-time costs would be between 73 and 78 million. From those costs, how much would be allocated to Mississauga, percentage-wise?
We're just pulling up the slide right now. Just give us a moment. So it'd be approximately 57% of the 73 to 78 million.
And when we looked at that, it's approximately 20 million a year for the first 2 years. And then we actually we realize 800 million over 10 years. So it's not a bad investment, would you say?
These are one-time transition costs that we calculated.
Okay. The chair's comment about Deloitte, or someone's comment about Deloitte being a catalyst, I'm kind of starting to think of them as the warm-up act, and you guys are the symphony, because you have all the staff signing off on all this, you have all the staff agreeing to this final report, and you have played with a very full orchestra to do all this. Had this dream team been hired in February, what would you have done differently, besides ruining weekends?
Well, that definitely, yeah. Victoria Day might have been different. The method that we have followed is, I think, the method that we would have recommended, to be honest with you. And it is the one that we are very, very comfortable with. I said earlier that the basis for understanding what the potential change in overall governance structure is at the highest level, and the way that it would potentially apply to each of the service lines, and then how it would have an impact on the underlying municipalities and or in an amalgamation strategy to a new municipality, is, I think, the structure that has been followed. I think that in broad terms, we would have done nothing differently, to be honest with you. We obviously would have had a bit more time to do it. There could have been a slightly different treatment of some of the issues where, you know, assumptions had to be made in the moment. But I suppose I can't speak entirely on behalf of the steering committee, but I would suggest to you that collectively we are very confident that this analysis represents an appropriate one, and that had we had more time, some refinement perhaps, but the overall approach, I think, is one that we would still recommend.
Now, given the concentration of time, I assume that has an impact on the fees that you've charged us, given that you all gave up weekends, as did our staff. Would that fee have been different if you'd had 3 or 4 months to do this?
Again, I do not believe so.
Okay.
The volume of work would not have changed. Obviously, the time within which it would have been conducted would have changed, but the actual level of effort, I believe, would be essentially the same.
I'm very impressed with the amount of time that your team put in. I'm increasingly proud of all 4 municipality staff. If they're in the audience, could you stand up so we at least see the rest of the orchestra? Janice is standing, come on.
The team, EY, stand up. Stand up. Angela, stand up.
And I just want to reinforce, they've all agreed to the conditions, they've all signed off on the final reports, and that team and you are all happy that what you've done is the best that you could do and accurate.
It is the best that we could do, yes.
Okay. One other thing I wanted to, that you touched on, the gentleman on the end who looks very intense, was, he can smile. He looks most intense when you two are answering, by the way. You can't see him. You touched on the devastation of Bill 108, and we are almost built out in Mississauga, and we were talking about this at our council meeting, and it's going to be horrible for community development and all the nicer parts of living. If, as a Mississauga partner, we are almost finished building and this 108 hits the other two partners, our taxpayers are going to be carrying a heavy load for other people's development. Is that not accurate?
I think that would be difficult for me to assess
Oh,
at the
come
moment.
on.
We'll hire him again to get him to say.
You just want us to hire you again, exactly. Again, I want to thank you very much. I think you guys have done an incredible job in the profession. You're highly respected, and I believe for good reason.
Thank you, Councillor Parrish, and well said. Mayor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. And can we put that first screen up again, comparing the Deloitte and the EY report? Oh. When I look at this report and looks at the risk for taxpayers under amalgamation dissolution, we get the same finding from Deloitte and EY that it's a huge risk. It's a huge risk for taxpayers under amalgamation and dissolution, and that the continuation of the region appeal protects the best interest of taxpayers in Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon. Everyone should look at this impact. It's enormous. And frankly, this is what should be showed to everyone in Brampton, Mississauga, and Caledon. It makes it crystal clear. That's why I welcome the report. It confirms the findings of Deloitte that this is a huge risk for taxpayers. No one right now is saying, raise my taxes enormously. No one is asking for that. And you look at this chart, it means massive service cuts or tax increases, and that's worrisome. A few things about the assumptions made and to get understanding of the elastic nature of the assumptions. If one municipality asked for an assumption to be made, but the other municipalities didn't, that's part of the elastic nature of the numbers. Is that correct?
I would say that the basis of conversation that led to consensus may have reflected starting positions that came forward, but that the actual consensus reflects consensus.
And so, for example, when you look at best case scenarios versus worst case scenarios, when you look at this exposure, I think that's a realistic look. You look at the potential high end, that's what you're looking at in terms of tax increases in Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon. Anyone that suggests we should work on best case scenarios with this provincial government, it's a bit of a stretch. Let's tell you a little secret that shouldn't be a secret. Doug Ford isn't out there bringing buckets of dollars to municipalities saying, how can I help you with your finances? So let's talk about one of the fantasy assumptions. Is there an assumption made that the province would help with transition costs? And a best case scenario?
No.
Okay, good. Is there an assumption that, made that the municipalities would simply adopt all the regional infrastructure geographically?
Well, there are a whole series of potential drivers about how one would have to deal with the allocation of existing assets and so forth. And again, that has been directly and explicitly incorporated.
So is the assumption that municipalities would assume infrastructure in their geographical boundary?
Well, if the appropriate driver is for municipal boundary, then yes. If it is on the basis of something else, like lane kilometers and so forth, but broadly speaking, I think you can say yes.
Okay, let's give an example. This building, it's in Brampton. What's the assumption? We have no use for this building, so I just want to know what the assumption would be. Yeah. If the region appeal continues, if the region appeal exists, then it has a purpose. Otherwise, if there's an independent city of Brampton, I want to know what happens to this building. Is the assumption is that you give it to the city of Brampton? But what if the city of Brampton doesn't want the building? Sell it. And I'll give you an example. This building here, there's not a lot of uses for it. So who carries the burden of the cost of trying to sell an asset that doesn't have a lot of use?
I'm pretty sure that with regards to this particular facility, it would have been modeled on the basis of geography.
Okay.
But then the discretion about whether or not you want to keep that and so forth would have been modeled as yours.
So it's modeled, or so hypothetically, if Brampton didn't find a use for a building like this, what happens? Under your assumptions, who carries the cost of that? If we have to demolish the building and sell it to as real estate.
So there was no dimension of the model that explicitly took a look at that particular scenario. The assumption would be that it would be transferred in the short term, and then the individual council would have to make that ongoing decision.
So we're talking about, once again, a best case scenario. You're assuming the city of Brampton would want to take this infrastructure.
A reasonable scenario about how in the, again, based on the scenarios and so forth, a reasonable assumption about how to do the allocation, no conclusion about what you would actually then choose to do to amend or moderate any of those things after the
I know it's a reasonable,
dissolution.
it's easier to make an allocation if you just say it goes within your geography. And of course, with a water treatment center in Mississauga, of course, it's going to be a water treatment center and that you need to continue that way. But with a building like this, that assumption doesn't work. And so what I'm trying to highlight is you're making, right now, we're looking at this chart and it shows huge increases for Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon using assumptions that are rosy. Frankly, when you talk about the litigation, you talk about Hicks-Morley and talk about if it leads to arbitration. In arbitration, no municipality wants this building. And you talk about down the line, what potential compensation would there be? My reading of the Hicks-Morley legal opinion is that if there's not an agreement successful through arbitration, that you're going to be in litigation over compensation. Like there's a lot of assumptions that this would be, that municipalities would just say, yeah, sure, we're going to agree on all this. These are rosy assumptions, but even with rosy assumptions, there's a huge cost for taxpayers. I also wanted to ask you about the police numbers. When you look at the MPAC model, does that include police costs that are specific to municipalities? So let me give you an example. The Peel Police just launched the Marine Unit. We probably don't need that Marine Unit, that beautiful new boat that they just launched last week. We probably don't need that in Brampton. So what breakdown have you done on police costs like that are specific to a municipality? I'm not sure if Mayor Thompson, if you'd have a use in Caledon for that boat either, but. I don't know if you put up credit. So what assumptions have you made about police costs that are specific to a municipality?
So that is the assumption, and it is reflective of the range in the model post dissolution.
So what is the assumption on the Marine Unit?
In that particular case, we can confirm it here, but that it would follow to the demand or requirement of. and that if there had been a marine unit that is obviously around Lake Ontario, that it would actually follow the call for service, the actual policing requirement, and that would be the basis of the assumption.
But based on the new boat that was launched Friday, the beautiful new boat that was purchased by the Peel Police, we wouldn't have any records of calls to service.
Yeah, but again, the mechanism through which, or the process through which those assumptions were both built and validated included quite extensive consultation with the regional police.
Were they able to provide you calls to service for the Marine unit?
I do not know.
Okay. Well, given the fact that that beautiful, expensive new boat was just launched Friday, I would be surprised if they were able to. So there's a lot of rosy assumptions, but even with these rosy assumptions, I look at these numbers once again, and it's a hard hit for Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon. Going to the termination cost of waste management, what's the worst case scenario on that? If what happened in Toronto, what's the worst case scenario on if we had to terminate that contract?
We're just going to see if we have those details here with us right now.
For reference, we did review over 2,000 contracts, so at the moment it'd be pretty difficult to find that one. But from my understanding, when we looked at termination costs, penalty costs, transfer of ownerships, what we found was on certain areas were likely, some areas were negligible, other areas in which we did see some type of cost involved of termination that what we would feel would be on the Board of Immaterial Material. We'd have that discussion with the steering committee to understand it's likely the assumption that it would be just carried out or until expiration. So to your point, I would not be able to comment on that specific contract per se.
Did you look at how they managed it in the City of Toronto during their amalgamation?
So I'm sure we did. However, the precedents and the case studies around dissolution are very, very few. And so it would be a challenge to find any kind of precedents to model against that. And when it comes to waste, that's where that would apply.
Can you share with us some of the other assumptions that you made under a low case scenario that could be challenging?
I mean, I think the point has to be absolutely emphasized that there are no assumptions that anybody involved in the examination thought were unreasonable. And so every one of them has got integrity, I would say.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is you look at this assumption from EY high to EY low, it's a big difference. I know both assumptions say it's going to cost more, but the differences are quite significant. What's your professional opinion of where it's going to end up lying?
And we make no prediction about what might actually happen in the future.
But either way, it costs more.
It's contingent, well, as modeled, based on the series of assumptions. On an annualized basis, those ranges that you're showing there would be completely, I mean, they're obviously much, much lower, but in an aggregate. As I think we have mentioned a number of times, there are a whole series, as I'm quite sure you well appreciate, a whole series of policy decisions that the province might make, that you would have to respond to a whole series of specific service by service, event by event, issue by issue matters to deal with, that in the end, we believe would fall in the range that has been presented.
It's just saying it's a big range. It's a huge risk for taxpayers. If you're a gambling person and your chances are bad news or worse news, That's not a good a bet to make, but I appreciate your efforts to try to bring clarity. And I say it is reassuring to know that we're finding very similar assessments, that there is a cost to taxpayers with both Deloitte and EY. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Brown. Councillor Demerla.
Thank you, Chair, and I would like to echo my colleagues' thank yous to all of you for everything you did, and also echo the sentiment that there's been some learning for us here, that, you know, when we are spending taxpayer dollars on reports, it's best to do it right and best to do it transparently with all of the data and all of the resources available to consultants. So I'm glad we got it right the second time. I just wanted to start by saying that Mayor Brown was characterizing some of the assumptions as being rosy, and I just wanted to confirm that the rosy assumptions were also agreed to by all of the staff, including the City of Brampton staff.
That is correct.
And in your professional judgment, would they be reasonable or rosy assumptions?
Reasonable.
Thank you. So that makes a big difference. My second question is, can we just go back to the slide where you had a summary of the impact of dissolution on all 3 municipalities? So the way no, not this one. You had a chart? Yes. No, there's another one. This one, thank you. So the way I read this, there is a scenario in which both Brampton and Mississauga could have savings in the event of dissolution. Would that be correct?
Yes, but I'd also premise that with it may not necessarily be the same scenario for both.
But is there a vector middle? Is there a middle, like there's 2 circles? Is there like an in-between where we can both win?
I would have to look at the numbers to answer that.
Okay. The other question is, setting aside dissolution just for 1 minute, the big thing that I got from this report is the fact that when it comes to policing, even if we had the status quo, the Mississauga taxpayer is paying more for the same service than other municipal taxpayers in the region of Peel. Would that be correct if we went with not with the impact model, but the service model?
Yeah, the cost range is, again, presented on page 7, and in either one of them. The delta is in the range of 39 to 53 for a separation of the board. And so regardless of the allocation method or the funding allocation method, both net cost of services would rise.
No, sorry, that was not my question. My question was setting aside dissolution in the status quo as we stand today. Do your numbers suggest that if we followed not the impact model, but more of a cost recovery model, where we paid for the services that we are getting, then Mississauga is right now overpaying for the services it is receiving from Peel Police?
Yeah, we did not model a change to the funding model in the status quo.
But would that be a reasonable inference from the numbers? That the Mississauga taxpayer is overpaying for the police services to the tune of about $60 million?
No, I think the only thing that can be said is that the existing funding model reflects the requirements in policy, and that is an accurate reflection.
No, sorry. There's a difference in the joint board, right? So that's the status quo model. There's a difference whether we use the impact model or the WAC model. Weighted average cost of policing. Right? So the weighted average cost of policing is where Mississauga pays for the services it actually receives from policing.
The impact is the status quo, right? If one moved to the WAC, There is no model under which that has been measured in the status quo, right? Is the inference that you're drawing that had we done that work, that it would reflect what is being shown here?
My inference is that if we were using right now the WAC model instead of the MPAC, Mississauga would be paying less for police board services.
We would have to do that explicitly, but I just think we would have to do that explicitly. We have not done that. And so,
Okay.
I mean, we can quickly do it if you'd like, but.
Just shifting gears a little bit, I know that the bulk of the savings that Mississauga sees comes from policing. Where's the rest coming from? Would you be able to comment on that?
So it's outlined in the public report in summary on page 26. There are issues or there are opportunities with regards to internal and other services, so corporate services and so forth. In land use planning, and in total, again, the range is shown as a potential savings of between $6 million on an annualized basis and $61 million on an upper bound. Page 26 is where you would look.
I just have one question and one comment. My question is, would you say that the assumptions that underlie the lower end of the costs for dissolution are achievable?
They are a reasonable set of assumptions. The issue of feasibility was discussed in the building of the assumptions. We do not, as we've said a number of times, we do not go to that next step and talk about the probability of one event or another. But again, the very careful consideration in the building of the assumptions to make sure that not only that they reflected what people were comfortable modeling as a potential outcome.
So that's a reasonable outcome. And finally, I just wanted to say, if this building, I believe, is on prime real estate right next to a big mall. So if Brampton didn't want this piece of land, I'm sure Mississauga would be delighted to take it and sell it and send the difference back to our taxpayers. Thank you.
It would make for a great regional chairman retirement residence, but we'll leave that to others. Thank you. Thank you very much, Demarla. Councillor Santos.
Thank you very much through you, Chair, and thank you, EY, for the report and your presentation today. I'm wondering if you could go back to that first slide with the bar graph on page 1. Perfect, thank you. So I appreciate and echo the comments made by Mayor Brown regarding the assumptions and whether we call them rosy or reasonable. The reality is that staff and yourselves were working in an incredibly high-pressure, limited time frame. And so any sort of assumptions that were made were essentially made based on the financial information we have today. I have a question about inflation. So in the yellow bars, the 2 yellow bars based on, I guess it would be 9 years for E&Y, inflation was not included in there?
It was included, but we would just brought it back to $2018, just to make it consistent.
Okay,
Yes.
so that assumption was made there. Okay. The next question is just, also, these assumptions based on this chart do not include sort of the funding cuts or funding or volatility of the provincial government at this point in time.
That's correct.
Because we can't really measure it, really. And it doesn't include the transition costs associated with either of the two options. It does or doesn't from the province, if the province would help us fund any of that.
Yeah, there's no assumption made that the province will help to support the transition costs.
Where in these costs here, were the costs associated with transition included in here already as part of the burden of all the various municipalities taking on those costs, or those your one-time transition costs that you included?
I mean, they are one-time transition costs that are borne in the first two years of the transition.
Okay.
Councillor Santos, the CFO, may have a comment on
Sure.
that. Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. Just in fairness to EY, this is a slide that regional staff prepared. So the EY numbers, and they've disclosed that already, that their costing includes the full transition costs paid for by the municipalities.
Okay. So that's borne by the municipalities with no support from the province and no additional funding uncertainty that's going to be downloaded to the various municipalities at all. So I think given the state that we're in with our provincial government, just to highlight again Mayor Brown's point, that we should not be looking at best case scenario. I think in a lot of the polling that the City of Brampton did in lead up to our decision on Wednesday to keep the region as is, the biggest concern across the region of Peel for residents was actually costs and the uncertainty around the costs. So from Brampton's perspective, it is our duty to all residents in the region of Peel to take the more precautionary approach. So if we could go to slide number 8 again on the tax impact. So there's a lot of talk about best case scenario savings, 45 million for Brampton, savings of 20 million for Caledon, 84 billion. But there is no discussion about the cost of 33 million, 23 million, and 28 million at this point yet in the conversation. So I just wanted to highlight that while there's some savings on the impact of dissolution highlighted by you within that range, there's also a potential cost. And when we're looking at the uncertainty around the provincial government, when we're looking at some of the assumptions that were not included because we can't calculate that given the amount of time we had to come up with this report, the precautionary approach when residents across the region of Peel are mostly concerned with costs and uncertainty around costs would be to look at the more higher sort of risk or impact on dissolution, which would be a cost associated to the residents in all 3 municipalities. Would that be a fair assumption to make?
I mean, I appreciate what you have said, and I understand it. That is not something that we looked at explicitly, but I do understand what you are saying.
Thank you. So can I go back to slide number 1 again? Sorry, I missed one point. So based on all of that, the assumptions that we know, given the limited time frame that staff had to agree on those assumptions, the uncertainty and volatility of the provincial government, unknown, uncertain sort of situation, the reality is in both of these reports, and specifically E&Y, within the low and high range, as quoted by staff, there is a higher net cost for both situations. I just want to confirm if that is correct, if I'm quoting that correctly. There is a higher net cost in both amalgamation and dissolution.
as compared to the status quo.
Yeah.
But again, a whole series of events and specific policy decisions and so forth would actually go to affect what would actually happen in the future, and we can't model that right now.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you. Councillor Fortini.
Thank you, through the chair. Just a couple of quick, one question. Have we included in this report, there's 5,900 people working at the region, all the severance pay, all the packages we have to do, all the jobs lost?
So we did include severance costs, but we did not include any other socioeconomic considerations. This was a financial impact analysis, and as part of that, we did include, or we did calculate the severance costs based on average tenure and the categories of management, and using that information to calculate what that might look like.
And Councillor Fortini, the CAO, may have a thought on that as well.
Thank you. I just want to make sure you're not assuming that all the employees in the region of Peel would lose their jobs. Under these assumptions, many of the assumptions assume that the region of Peel staff who are currently working in an area such as waste or trans help would move with the service to the lower tier municipality. And then there were assumptions made about how, if there was additional work to be done, how much of that additional work could be assumed assumed by the existing staff at the local municipality. So that drove some of the cost estimates. There were assumptions made in both Deloitte and E&Y about the number of staff, primarily senior staff, whose positions would become redundant. And so that's where the severance costs were worked out. But it wasn't for, the 5,000 staff working here.
Okay, but there's still a percentage.
There is, a percentage
I would
based,
say maybe
based
40%,
on...
50%, and then, or it should still be in the cost here, whatever percentage it is.
Yes, the assumptions, the costs were nowhere near 50% of the staff. It's much smaller than that, and it was based on service line, and also based on the local municipalities' assumptions about how that work would now be integrated into the work that they're currently doing in the local municipalities. The reason I'm raising this, I don't want, there are 5,000 people working here, and I don't want them to think that in any scenario we have modeled all of them losing their work.
Well, okay, I'm just pushing it towards Ford government creating jobs, but meanwhile, and I'm worried about the jobs here. Thank you.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, that what Premier Ford may do through funding will happen regardless of governance decisions at the region of Peel, I'm sure.
Councillor Fortini, anything further? Thank you. Mayor Crombie.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to clean up a couple ideas that were left on the table. First, can we reconfirm that all the assumptions made, rosy or otherwise, were all agreed to by all the players and their CAOs that we have a lot of confidence in by all 4 levels of government, all 4 municipalities, right?
Yes.
Right. Also, kind of to speculate on Bill 108 that isn't finalized, we have no idea what the impact of that would be, what the costs would be, and certainly each municipality would have to bear those costs. It may add to costs, but we don't know what that is yet because the bill's still in discussion and still in committee, so kind of a red herring at this point. As was the job loss. I was going to speak to that too, but the CAO did. So finally, a couple more things actually. We talk about 77 million in costs, and we calculated that Mississauga's share would be about 40 million. So 20 million over 2 years, 40 million. What was the number for Brampton and Caledon? And these are the transition costs I'm talking about.
Yeah.
The transition.
So I can provide you percentages of that number. So it'd be approximately 57%
For Mississauga, so that's our 40 million.
Yeah, Brampton's about 38%, and the remainder of 5% would be for Caledon.
So certainly, if they were able to realize savings, as you said, was reasonable and achievable, because we're all very well-run municipalities, all 4 levels of government, very efficient, very well-run, so very conceivable, reasonable, that savings would be realized, they could be paid for. Those transition costs could be paid for over the first 2 years in the savings.
Yeah, we don't talk about how transition costs would actually be funded, just the level that would need to be borne.
I mean, there was a notion put out there that any change, specifically a dissolution, the cost would be borne by the taxpayer and taxes could go up. And we have to dispel that notion because there would be efficiencies and savings. And I can only look at Mississauga's case and have to say that there would be no plans to raise any taxes whatsoever. In fact, would be an opportunity to reinvest that money in our priorities, and who knows, we could even vote on a tax decrease if that's what the council decided. So this is kind of a misinformation that this is, under certain scenarios, is a big risk. Certainly, Mississauga financial metrics are very strong. We think that the high end is the 84 million in savings is very achievable. Our staff are very confident that it is. It's supported by our own numbers. So I would think that it's very manageable, and no one in Mississauga foresees anything other than benefit and a reinvestment of money, those savings, into our top priorities. At the end of the day, you know, wrong sheet, hang on, I just want to make another point. We've held this position that Mississauga in any dissolution would be better off financially, but also from a governance perspective, the ability to manage our own decisions if we were to be independent. It's a view that we've held for a very long period of time. But it doesn't surprise me that the other municipalities want to retain the status quo. But we have to assure them, and please, can you help me assure them that those high-end savings are achievable for everyone, right? Because of the efficiencies and the operating, the way each municipality operates.
Yeah, again, I'm afraid that we didn't go into a prediction of or an assessment of the probability. Again, we established the bounds and then run the financial impact assessment.
Okay. And finally, I know the Mayor Brampton spoke about the concern about this building, and which I agree is prime real estate. I guess we would probably take on 7120 here, Ontario, which is just north of Derry. So we would have the same dilemma. Could we fill it with our own staff? Could we repurpose it? Could we sell it? And I think that would be true of us as well. But I'm quite excited about the prospect of repurposing that building. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Crombie. Councillor SAITO.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could you put up the first slide that showed the bar slide? Sorry. I don't know what number it is because it's not in here either. That one. So this slide was being used by the Mayor of Brampton and my colleague here, Councillor Santos. But this doesn't break down the costs per municipality. So it's a really big assumption to say that the dissolution costs for all municipalities are going to be that high. When the rest of your report, the numbers are showing that with dissolution, the costs for Mississauga would be lower. So why was everything lumped together and not broken down by municipality?
So we didn't prepare this one. I think maybe
was that a
CFO would want to do that.
Oh,
I
I'm
do
sorry,
believe
that's
that it
staff.
is
Sorry, that's a staff one, right.
consolidated view. Yeah, I
Okay,
believe
so I'm
that's
going
true.
to, sorry, I'm going to ask staff then. So these numbers, you've consolidated, you didn't break it down per municipality. Why not?
So we received the report similar to council last minute.
Well, okay, yeah.
And what we had was the consolidated numbers. We didn't have the underlying detail to be able to break it
Okay.
down. There are,
Okay.
as the slide 7 showed on the police, there are tax burden shifts in a dissolution. There isn't a tax burden shift in an amalgamation, but there would be in a dissolution scenario.
Okay, so I find this slide, I'm very disturbed with the fact that this slide is here, quite honestly, because I think it is misleading to the citizens of Mississauga, and it is being used, and with all due respect, Mayor Brown, I know you tweeted this slide saying that the overall cost in the region of Peel would be extremely high with dissolution. And I'm tweeting to my taxpayers saying that this slide does not reflect the impact on Mississauga. So I understand there is an impact, there is a cost to Brampton, and you are perfectly, you're doing what you should be doing to let your taxpayers know that. And if we were in that position, we'd be saying the same thing. But I think if we're going to put a slide and make it public, then it should be accurate and it should reflect the numbers that are here. So I'm going to ask regional staff if now that, and I realize you didn't have much time to take a look at this, but I am going to ask you that if you could provide us with another slide at whenever you can that actually breaks this down by municipality. Because I think that's what my taxpayers want to know, what the cost to them is, not the overall cost, because that's what we have to deal with in our local budgets. I want to follow up also on the comment that Councillor Demerla made, because I thought I had asked that question and it was answered about the policing and the fact that Mississauga is paying, I think the number was on slide 7, was $67 million more. And your response to her was different than your response to me. You said you hadn't you hadn't worked that out, but I guess my assumption was that you showed on the slide, and maybe you could put it up, you showed on that slide a joint board. So I assumed that those numbers for a joint board were the same numbers that we have today. And when I asked you if we went to the 50-50, based on the numbers at the top on the joint board, would we be saving $67 million? Your answer was yes. You gave a different answer to Councillor Demerla. You said you didn't know that.
Well, I didn't intend.
Okay.
So there's a really kind of precise nature to this.
Well,
answer,
roughly.
right?
Okay, I'm not saying precisely 67.
We did not, for the status quo
right.
model, an alternative funding formula.
Okay, so you're saying
for
that a
the
joint
dissolution
board,
model, the understanding that is presented here
right.
is that essentially, and it's in 2022, that the starting position is the status quo model,
right.
but the dissolution, the application of the funding option,
right.
Or scenario, not option, but scenario, is only applied to the dissolution model, not to the status quo model.
Right, okay. I guess my assumption was then, and maybe inaccurately, that having a joint board with a net cost and service of $461 in 2022 wouldn't be that much different than status quo costs in 2022. So when I asked the question, I was sort of assuming that that $461 million would be the same for status quo as it would be for dissolution. And I can understand the separate boards is different. So I kind of looked at it at the same thing, and it might be off a little bit, but I don't think it would be that different, would it?
Yeah, I mean, we would go back, we would talk to the steering committee, we would come up with an assumption.
Okay, well, your assumption and my assumption then were a little bit different. I just can't see the difference in 2022 from status quo to a joint board, because a joint board is status quo. So I'm still taking your answer to my question. Going to the 50-50 model for Mississauga would save $67 million with a joint board. And you answered yes to that. Roughly, approximately.
Under the dissolution scenario, yes.
Yes, okay, thank you.
And thank you. And I think under the circumstances, thank you, Councillor SAITO. Councillor Demerla, you're at the bottom of the list, but on that point, why don't you speak again right now?
Thank you, Chair, for that indulgence. Perhaps a simple way to phrase what Councillor SAITO and I are trying to say is, could we say that your numbers here for the joint board are a good proxy for the status quo? And so the numbers could be used as a good proxy to say that under the status quo, using the joint board as a proxy, that Mississauga taxpayers are perhaps overpaying for police services.
Yeah, I would, but just by structure, and it's a very, very important one, and we obviously think that it is vital to the way that this whole examination has been conducted. The steering committee could take that issue and make a determination, and I think that that wouldn't take very long for them to do, for us as with the steering committee to do.
Thank you. And Stephen, last thought on that to you, if you had a thought on point.
Through the chair, with respect to Councillor Saito's question around the modeling of the tax burden shifts, certainly we attempted that modeling last night. We would need to work closely with Ernst & Young. As they've described, there's a significant number of assumptions and scenarios that are at play to create the upper and lower bands, which for one municipality will look different than for another municipality because it's a different set of assumptions. So we'd really need to work closely with them to create that visual that shows that tax burden shift under both the lower band and the upper band. But I'm certainly working with them, we can do that.
And we would be happy to do that.
And just one quick point before I go to, and I'm glad you use that phraseology. You have to distinguish between a tax burden shift and a true savings, because somebody else's savings may be somebody else's tax burden shift. I think we all have clarity on that as well. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Saito. Thank you, Councillor DeMerla. Back to my list, Councillor Carlson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the gentleman. Or if you guys get tired of your business, politics might be a good business for you to go into. Your answers are excellent, but you got to pull on somebody's hair to get them from you. So I'm going to take a different tact completely. I really want to know, like, your level of accuracy in general when you're doing the same stuff for Ford and Chrysler and who knows who else. You guys' accuracy somewhere between the guy gives me stock advice and the weatherman, or are we talking about, are you in the 90th percentile? And I don't want a long answer. I just kind of want to know how good, looking back, you guys, are you high-fiving, or you kind of go, whoa, man, Ford ain't going to hire us again?
We have a high degree of confidence.
Okay, well, that's kind of what I was looking for in a straight-up answer. Well, in terms of the police, this, I don't know if I can add any intelligence, but the scenario, would it be correct to say that depending on what new model, let's say we went to dissolution, we created a new police model, could civilized people not agree to do a transition, say over 3 years or 5 years, if there was a shift? Like you're sort of modeling immediately everybody pay as you play. I believe that's, if I understand it correctly, but there's no rule about this. I'm assuming that, because that would be one heck of a burden between Brampton and Mississauga. I would think if you went right to pay as you play, or whatever the cost recovery from each municipality is. And there's been a lot of that thinking here today. This is going to come as a lump, whereas I think good and decent people can talk about transition. Real estate, for instance, comes to mind. What would be the rush to sell off buildings or repurpose them for their lower use, when in fact there could be time, a couple of years or something, to figure out some of the real estate, and a board of internal people who would take a look at this sensibly, real estate appraisers, et cetera. Like there's a sort of a crash and burn feeling around the table today that's going to hit all hard on January 1st, something or other, when in fact, it's been a long partnership in Peel. And I haven't heard a word about how one might go about, maybe with assistance of folks like yourselves, to do an internal transition that is reflective of our spirit of cooperation. So I'd like to get your comment on that, because I don't like the guillotine sound of this operation so far.
Well, the model assumes a 2-year period, and that's obviously to help to be instructive to the overall assessment of the issue. Again, in the specific comments that are made about the future analysis, the further analysis and work that needs to be done, much of what you're talking about is in fact highlighted in there. That there would need to be the determination of first of all, the determination of what it is that you're actually responding to, and then we would suggest quite quickly the determination of an appropriate response to that, the building of specific plans about how you would do it, item by item, issue by issue. And I would say that it's probably a fair assumption that you would build those plans and you would do the necessary work in the spirit that you have just outlined.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, I know the moment of absolute certainty never arrives. You're not going to have everything worked out down to who gets the cafeteria or cutlery. That's not going to be possible, I'm sure, or not even desirable. But in your experience with this, does it degenerate into dirty business of litigation and we'll never settle, or are these sorts of deals with professional people done relatively painlessly or relatively with a certain amount of cooperation? You have a lot of experience with which I don't in this particular field.
The particular set of circumstances is, we think, unique, that has been analyzed, and so there's no, historical experience that is directly related to this. The way that I would say to you is that there was much discussion at steering committee about the issue of maintaining service levels, of maintaining the, what's the right word, the an appropriate impact on people. And that the steering committee members, and I'm sure it's quite reflective of members of council and of others, were very conscious of the requirement to model a series of assumptions that could in fact be reasonably and feasibly managed so that the actual outcomes were maintained as effectively as possible. Okay, so, and I think that people were really conscious of that and thought very deeply about it. And then inform the specifics about assumptions, specifics about the various dimensions of this, and then this financial impact analysis reflects that.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, George.
I'm encouraged by that, and many thanks again to our staff for putting this together as quickly and compassionately as they could.
Hear, hear. Mayor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. So if you look at the low end of the cost estimates, it's essentially saying that all the stars are going to be aligned. And as we've seen in past municipal amalgamations, the notion that all the stars are going to be aligned is pretty unlikely. And so what I want to delve into is the high-end cost exposure for each municipality. Can you tell me under that chart we looked at before of the low end and the high end cost exposure for the, I'm sure if we can get it back up on the screen, that original graph. The high end cost exposure for dissolution, what would be the Mississauga's number there? What's Mississauga's high end exposure?
We'll just find that number specifically and direct you to it.
To give you the forewarning, I'll be asking the same thing about Brampton and Caledon after that.
I mean, it's on a net cost of service basis. It's the answer is on page 26. If I understand the question correctly, the upper bound would be 1.516 billion for Mississauga, about 150.
So, okay, can we say that again? How much?
I don't think that's what we're talking about. That's what
Is
sorry, that's the dissolution consolidated net cost of service versus status quo.
I mean, this is really what it comes down to, right? I was focused on the total cost, and you look at that
talking
scary.
about the delta, sorry, not
you
the,
look at that
not
scary
the,
graph.
Sorry, I was giving you the actual net cost of service number. Yeah, yeah. The delta. We will have to come back to you on that. It is not in this set of numbers, but we would. I think the decision has been taken. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. I'm not trying to talk for anybody, but that we would work with the region, particularly on this slide, to try and come up with precisely what the disaggregation of those dissolution numbers would be.
Okay.
So we would take that and we would come back to you.
And I wish something as simple as that would be available today, but what is this number here? It looks like close to 800 million for the high end for Peel Region?
Peel Region, yeah.
Yeah. What is it, 800 million?
No, 61.
Through the chair, $755 million.
755 million for Peel Region. That's the exposure if not all the stars are aligned. So we're trying to have sort of one speaker at a time out of fairness. That's why we have a list. So 755 million, that's the hit for taxpayers in Peel Region. Someone suggested that there be no cost to Mississauga under that scenario, a previous speaker. Of the 755 million, would a portion of that be Mississauga's hit? Whether it's 200 million, 300 million, whatever it is, what is a portion of that 755 million Mississauga?
Yes. It
Yes.
would be, it's consolidated across.
Yes. So any suggestion that there's not going to be a hit on taxpayers in Mississauga based on that is factually untrue. This is a huge hit, 755 million. And as Councillor SAITO noted, she wants to know what the individual numbers are. And that's what this comes down to. I don't want to hear the best case scenario of 100 stars aligned, what it's going to mean, and maybe if we get really lucky, it's not going to be as bad as we feared. I want to know, of that 755 million, how much it's going to cost my residents in Brampton. I think the Mississauga elected officials should deserve to know how much it's going to cost every family in Mississauga, and the residents of Caledon deserve to know that. And frankly, we've invested a lot into this report, and if I can't get that simple answer today, I'm going to be honest, I'm disappointed. I want to know what the exact number is for Mississauga of the 755 million. I want to know what the exact number for Brampton is, because some people are suggesting that there's nothing for Mississauga. There's no cost to that 755 million. But that's not the case. You said there'd be a cost. I want to know, I want everyone in Mississauga to know, given the position the city of Mississauga is taking, how much it's going to cost them under this projection. We know what's the cost. I think Mississauga residents just need to know how bad that cost is going to be, how much it's going to hit Mississauga families. That's the number we want to have, and hopefully before you conclude this presentation, you can share with all of Regional Council what the hit is, what the cost is, what the burden is for taxpayers in Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon, breaking up that 755 million figure. I appreciate the suggestion of Pat SAITO. We have to know that number. We should know it today.
Thank you, Councillor Paleshi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if we're going to get that answer today, but I think that first of all, I want to thank you for coming in and delegating to Council today and answering a lot of the questions. I think that you know, in the public sector, we use a lot of assumptions to determine you know, some of the decisions that we make, and in the private sector, you know, you really assume nothing. And you try not to use assumptions, but public's a little bit different. We have to do that sometimes. I think each municipality has clearly identified here today that we can spin your report to best suit each municipality, and that's based on the fact that we're using assumptions. I think it's unfortunate that there's only going to be really one decision maker in this outcome, and that's the Premier. And I think that the only people that are really going to make money and be happy is after he makes that decision are going to be the lawyers, because unfortunately, whatever decision he makes, there's municipalities and people that aren't going to accept or like that. So I want to thank staff from all municipalities. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we beat the issue to death. I'm happy to move receipt of the delegation.
Thank you. At the appropriate time, you've been acknowledged as such. Mayor Thompson.
You guys have been on the hot seat for almost 3 hours. Well done. What I want to basically say concerning the taxpayers for the region appeal, basically status quo is the way to go. Question is, when you were doing this analysis, both the dissolution and for amalgamation, did you see any glaring efficiencies that need to be found or that were glaring at you for the status quo?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Demerla.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a little confused now because I'm looking at page 26 of this one. And the way I read it is, in the status quo, the total costs is 2.7 billion. Would that be correct? For the entire region, everybody together consolidated?
In 2022, yes.
And so the maximum exposure is 61 million, right? In dissolution at the time, like the worst case scenario for everybody combined is 61 million?
That's shown on an annualized basis in 2022, 2018 dollars, yes.
So the difference between the 755 and the 61 is one is over a 10-year period and one is over annualized.
It is over, yeah, so it's over the entire forecast period. It also, in the larger, the 755 number also includes the specific issue of the DC effect as well.
Okay, so that's fair. So I think it's really important to keep that period in mind. You know, when we're using these numbers, whether it's over a decade or whether it's over a one-year period. So the only question is, for Mississauga, we have also savings of $84 million post-dissolution. Is that worst-case scenario, best-case scenario, the reality? Where does that fit in? Because, you know, you can't at once say there will be costs and then say there's savings.
Again, there are no probabilities associated and no predictions associated with this.
But the 84 million, that number has to exist in some context. So I'm just trying to understand how realistic is that 84 million cost savings on dissolution beginning 2022 for Mississauga taxpayers?
There are no probabilities associated with the calculation of that, and so that answer is not possible.
As I understand it, if you'll indulge me, I believe that if we follow the WAC model of allocating policing costs, that is a certainty. $84 million would be a certainty based on the assumptions.
It reflects the entirety of the potential changes, not just that one.
But that's driving it, right? The 84 million in savings, it's policing.
There is a significant dimension, yes.
Right, and that is under, that's, all I'm saying is that that model is not in a vacuum. It exists, it's credible, it's reasonable, and it's a fair assumption.
It reflects the assumptions that have been taken by the examination, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Parrish.
Well, first of all, I heard somebody say that you're going to be doing some remodeling with the region. I would prefer that you do the remodeling with the original orchestra.
And that would be entirely appropriate, I think, as well.
Well, not only appropriate, but in fact, I think we would insist, because doing it with just one branch would not have an impact on the rest of us. You have to know that.
Would be happy to take that instruction.
Thank you. And secondly, Mayor Brown, I have to compliment you. You must have been a great lawyer, because when you can't win and the facts aren't in your corner, you stir up the dust and you pull out the big numbers and you make these guys nervous. So now they're backing down on a comment they put right in the executive summary that says we're going to come out with $84 million a year. So you did a fine job with that. And luckily, you probably won't be talking to Premier Ford, so you won't be able to do the same snow job down there. Hey, come on. I mean, I use the same techniques he uses, only he's better at it. I want to remind everybody, Mayor Brown moved the motion that commissioned this report, and I thank you for doing that. We can't always be happy with the results of the motions that we move. We also had Deloitte here by their own admission saying they were literally told they could not discuss this with the other levels, which is why you moved that report or that motion. So what I want is the Deloitte to go into the distant past now. They should not be first on the regional website. This report, which was signed off by all of us, paid for by all of us, should be first on the website, and Deloitte can bring up the rear. But this report, you can cast all the aspersions you want on it. You guys are getting weaker by the minute over here. This is politics at its worst, and you got to be careful not to get involved in it, but you have to stand by your number. In the executive summary, you said $84 million. I've also heard several times that we're going to assume $20 million a year for 2 years in costs. So 84 million times 10 years, it's worth the 40 million to us. And there's no way on earth we don't carry our lion's share of what goes on up here. And we're blocked. I have developments that I want to get through for social housing, and I can't get a road through because it's on Airport Road. And these guys up here block us. We're not just doing this because of numbers. We're doing this for the good of our city and our people. But don't let Mayor Brown weaken your resolve, because you put it in print. And if it's in print, you can't take it back. Agree, Maurizio?
Agreed, with a smile on my face.
Thank you.
And Mr. Brown's come back on my list. Mayor Brown, you were named. You were named, so on a point of privilege, you're next up.
So first of all, in terms of what was put into print, what was put into print was $755 million for the region appeal, a huge hit for Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon. That's what's in print. So thank you, Maurizio, for saying that you stick by what's in print. In terms of what Councillor Topeka Demarla mentioned, in terms of the response to being able to guarantee the $84 million in savings, I think the response was quite significant here. Can you guarantee this hypothetical $84 million in savings for Mississauga?
I mean, we're just going right back to the first principles associated with this, and the entire exercise is not a prediction of the future.
And it is actually, so Mississauga talks about a potential $84 million. And what we've learned, and thank you, Councillor DeMiller, for asking those questions. What we learned is that $84 million, it could be a fictional figure, and that it could actually be a cost every year for Mississauga. So when you say 84 million times 10 years, you're talking about a potential fantasy world. And so what I want to know, and this it gets back to, is what is the exposure going to be for Mississauga each year under that $755 million scenario? So let's not talk about if 100 stars align. Let's talk about that $755 million figure. What's going to be the cost for Mississauga every year? And that's what we need to know today.
And you've put that question before Mayor Brown. I'll leave it at that. Councillor DeMille, I extend you the same privilege. You were named. Would you like to respond now?
Thank you, Chair. I guess my only question to you is very simple. You guys did a very thorough analysis, and you sat down and you went line by line. And as I understand it, the $84 million is the result of you guys going line by line in the event of dissolution, based on certain assumptions that the City of Brampton's leadership, the City of Caledon's leadership, and the City of Mississauga's leadership agreed to. That is how business is conducted. Every single business anywhere in the world is conducted on that basis, where you always make some assumptions. If the assumptions are reasonable, which you have said that they are reasonable, then I believe that those $84 million in savings are absolutely credible. Would that be a fair assessment?
At one end of a range, as represented and reported, yes.
Thank you. And finally,
Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Councillor Medeiros.
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you for the report. One thing that's been burning me in terms of this report is what's not in the report. And I know internally in Brampton, we talked about, for example, opportunity costs. There seems to be this perception that Mississauga has sort of subsidized the other municipalities and have subsidized the Brampton taxpayer. And when you look at, for example, if we were to look at the last 20 years, would it be fair to say, or is it safe to say that Mississauga, majority of budget allocation, but I would assume majority of investment has gone into Mississauga from the region, be it in services, be it in infrastructure, and key to the development has been that infrastructure. So I think what leaves a bad taste, first is the perception that this money is going out, but it's actually coming in and has allowed them to build the way they've built. And when it's Brampton's turn, our Brampton taxpayer looks around and we don't have that same infrastructure. We don't have that same investment. We don't have that same opportunity cost. So I don't see this in the report. And I think that's part of the story that hasn't been told. What I've heard is the 84 million we're going to save. Well, how about all the investment that Mississauga has received from the region? That Brampton taxpayers had to subsidize, had to also contribute. And I know that's something that you can't comment, but I assume when they were talking about assumptions, opportunity cost, was it ever discussed amongst the three municipalities and yourselves to look at? And I assume the decision was we couldn't really look at that. Is that correct?
Yes, that was not part of the examination.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Parrish.
I'd like to come at the 84 million from a different direction. If you took a moment in time today, could you confidently say we are currently spending 84 million a year more than we would be if we weren't in the region? Today. Forget the future. Your numbers must show we're over-contributing.
That is not analysis that has been conducted.
Okay. Then I'm going to go back to my suggestion that this report, which was commissioned and paid for by the whole region, takes precedence on our website for the 12 people that are actually going to go to the website and read it. And I would suggest that we behave the way our staff did, and we don't put this to a north and south of the Mason-Dixon line vote, that we just agree that we all paid for it, our staffs all worked on it, everybody cooperated. This is the piece that was for the whole region, not just for one municipality or another, and put this first on our website. I'd love you to take Deloitte off, but I wouldn't insult them that way because it's not their fault. They were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. So I would like a decision on your part, Mr. Chair. I'd rather not put it to a vote.
Councillor Parrish, thank you, and I think you're absolutely right. In the normal course, I would have wanted to do a flow just as you've described. I think that's totally appropriate. It is the most freshest report. It's the one we've all signed off on, so to speak, if you will. I think it's only appropriate that it presents the, I would have intended that in any event. With the Deloitte and any other course, but we've had to follow alongside accordingly. Okay, with that, again on my list, Councillor Vicente.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to members of council. Just a comment. One of the things that obviously is not reflected in either the Deloitte's report or the ENY report is what do the people of Peel Region think about this entire process? When I look at the media landscape, the City of Mississauga has done a superb job of communicating their position, and their position about preferring the separation option has been, I think, very well telegraphed on television, radio, print, and digital media. Whereas in Brampton, we have done that, been engaging with our residents in a different way, with a more thoughtful approach based on what is the research saying to us. Despite the amazing penetration that I believe the City of Mississauga has been able to achieve through media, it's interesting that according to polling that the City of Brampton conducted across the entire of the region of Peel, and the results are in your package that was left at your stations today. And if you look at added item 14.1, we have a chart that shows the results of what the people of Peel think about this. And at the end of the day, some of the comments around the table have been correct to say that this is going to be a political decision, not a financial one. Because the numbers don't lie, and with whichever assumptions you end up going with, you're going to get different results. The City of Mississauga has been very clear that there's this potential for $85 million in savings if dissolution is followed. And despite that very clear fact in the mind of all the residents of Mississauga, I find it very interesting that not even half of polled Mississauga residents believe that dissolution is the right choice for them. In contrast, when polling residents in Caledon and residents in Brampton, we have been very clear that we have a concern about the potential costs to all of the people in the region. And we achieve a result of more than 60% of residents wanting to remain with the status quo. And I think that that's very important because we haven't actually gone to the people in any formal sense to inquire what they believe. With less than 50% of Brampton residents wanting to see dissolution, that number doesn't even meet the requirement for a majority vote. It certainly fails in terms of a supermajority vote. And in contrast, the results that we have from both Brampton and Caledon would meet the test for a supermajority, which says that we want to keep the status quo. And I hope that I prefaced. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I hope that the Premier will consider the Brampton submission and the fact that we did our homework. And in addition to that, we also sought the opinion of residents, not just in Brampton, but across the entire region. And I think that that's very important as part of their consideration, because it's not just about the numbers. It's about what do the people prefer and how they wish to see their services delivered. And the numbers don't lie. They are happy with the delivery of service in the region of Peel through the two-tier system. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That exhausts my list. I have had receipt moved by Councillor Paleshi, seconded by Councillor Parrish, if she would. Just a show of hands to receive the report, or it's already been passed on, but to receive the deputants. Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your work, and I would be remiss as well if I didn't include my praises on behalf of all of Council for the work that all four entities have done, because it was under some very difficult circumstances, some excellent work that was done, and you're to be commended for it. And I express my gratitude as Regional Chair on behalf of the Region of Peel. Thank you. Now, to my colleagues, normally I try to squeeze a half hour out of your lunchtime to keep working through, but we have 3 more presentations. Lunch is available. I think we might decompress over lunch for the next 20 minutes or so, if that's acceptable, and I want you back at 12:30
And
so that the
Chair,
next 3 deputants.
quick point of order. Will we have that number
We will
for
follow
today?
up with them accordingly.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
So a motion to recess till 12:30 to come back for the documents. Thank you all. Ladies and gentlemen, we're past the appointed hour, and I want to keep you all moving along. Just a couple of administrative items that I think fall into the category of good news. To her credit, Councillor Santos got an update on 9.1 and 13.2 and is satisfied, so they otherwise would not have to be on the consent agenda, so I may try to work through those accordingly at that time. And furthermore, Mayor Brown, with regards to your question to Ernst & Young about the follow-up data, our CAO was good enough to speak to them, and they've provided us to the chair through the clerk the following response on the question that was asked, and if the clerk could read that out now.
To answer Mayor Brown's request requires additional calculations that are being conducted forthwith. The analysis will be conducted, its results validated by steering committee, and reported to you once complete. It will not be available for today's council meeting and will be communicated at the earliest point after completion.
Okay.
When it's communicated to you, can you just, do we have everyone's permission to share that with everyone, whatever the response is?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's get right back into it. We're on to item 8.1, staff presentation. Update on the Region of Peel inflow and infiltration reduction and mitigation strategy presentation by Anthony Parente, Acting General Manager, Water and Wastewater Divisions. And Anthony, as you come forward, I will congratulate you on your interim posting. Well done.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of Regional Council. My apologies here for bringing you a presentation after your lunch about the Region of Peel's sanitary sewer system. I'm not doing that on purpose. So our intent today is to take you a little bit through our inflow and infiltration strategy update. Many of you were here last year when we brought you an update about our plan strategy. So today we'll give you a bit of an update, but we'll start out, of course, with a bit of a summary about what inflow and infiltration is. Inflow and infiltration really is nothing more than non-sanitary sources of water entering our sanitary sewer system. And it typically enters our system through two main channels. One is through direct connections. These could be manholes or open type manholes. It could be directly connected catch basins, or it could be related to defects in our sewers that tend to collect groundwater that's in our system. Why is IANNICCA a concern? Probably the biggest message to convey here is sanitary sewers are only designed to convey wastewater. And no, this isn't a picture of a community water fountain or a water park. This is an exploding manhole because of inflow and infiltration. What happens is, as the conveyance capacity of our pipelines reach their limit, they will start to bubble up and eventually come out from a manhole just like this, spilling into our environment and our creeks. And this tends to result in surcharging in this example and basement flooding, and then of course the environmental discharge. So why is IANNICCA a problem? Well, really at its foundation, IANNICCA costs money. It costs us money to treat. We lose capacity in our sewers, we lose capacity for future development and growth, and it costs us money for insurance claims and administration claims. But really beyond the money here is we're supposed to be stewards of the environment. And the impact is to our reputation and to our environment and to our communities who have to deal with issues like this related to closed beaches or contaminated waterfronts. So, take you a little through what a storm and sanitary infrastructure looks. This is a typical cross-section of our residential communities. And on those communities, you'll always see two types of pipelines, one storm, one sanitary. And each fixture in your home, whether that be laundry, whether that be a floor drain, whether that be your shower, is connected to the right source. What we have here is seeing those two standards. Now, during a flood event, this is what happens. If we get a lot of rain and our storm sewers can't deal with that conveyance capacity of the storm, we start to get overland flooding. Many of you in Mississauga and Brampton have seen that in recent storm events. What ends up happening is if the sewers can't convey that, it'll back up against your home, end up coming through cracks in your foundations, and you will get storm-related flooding in your basement. It's not necessarily II. However, if that source ends up becoming or ends up in our sanitary sewers, it will mix with our sanitary flows and do the same thing. It will exceed the conveyance capacity of that pipeline and end up flooding basement from a sanitary perspective. So we have two types of basement flooding that, of course, we see here in the region. So, as you can see, there's lots of examples region-wide here, and this is during dry weather conditions here. This is groundwater draining into our system during dry weather. These are all Region of Peel examples that we've seen over the last few years. What's sad about IANNICCA, it's even prevalent in new construction. You can see here the green PVC, and anyone who's been involved in construction knows green PVC related to sanitary sewers. These are relatively new sewers. The one on your right is a brand new 48-inch or 1,200 millimeter pipeline that was just installed. And when the groundwater, of course, came back, all of a sudden staff started to hear that in the flow. This is a brand new pipe on the right. So II isn't really always related to old pipelines. It can also be related to new infrastructure. So how do we quantify? Pardon the bit of technicalities here, but we can see here a typical day, a nice bright sunny day. What does the flow look like in our sewer system? We could see everyone gets up in the morning, showers, and uses the toilet or whatever, and we see an increase in flow. Over the day, as we're all at work, that flow tends to peter out and increases again in the evening, and then when we go to sleep, it dies down significantly. On a rainy day, day B, you can see on the right here, if we have a storm event, that storm shows we see an abnormal pattern. That's how we can tell that an area is subject to II. So what do we do about it? Well, in order to actually mitigate its impacts here, we have to first assess all the areas within Peel to understand where the II is coming from before we can deliver a plan. And that's what our strategy is predicated on. The first and foremost part of our investigation is go out and find it, of course. Just like I said, go out and find that source. As you can imagine here, the region is a huge place with over 3,500 kilometers of sewer and over 55,000 manholes. Our system is just too large to attack I&I all at once. But we have done a number of work throughout Peel to start to measure that II flow that exists in our system. And then we prioritize those areas into our top 10. And you can see these in gray here. Because of our limits on resources and what we can really do in the course of a given year, we've identified our 3 top areas that we want to commence work on, or we have already commenced work on in 2019. And we did that by not just looking at high II. We also looked at what is the area known for? Does it have some flooding history? Is its infrastructure very old? Is there a high risk, or do we have anticipated growth? So we've picked these 3 areas as our top areas to work in over the next year. What do we do then? So once we are able to find that II, of course, then we can actually commence rehabilitation of those areas, and then we can implement a number of capital solutions in order to be able to mitigate that II. The picture on the right gives you an example here. And if you look closely, you can see the new manhole adjustment rings on the top here. And if you look at the bottom, you can actually see that pipe has been realigned. So this is an example of a rehabilitated piece of infrastructure. How do we do that? Well, what measures gets improved here? And it's absolutely essential. It's not glorious work that we have to go down all these maintenance holes and install flow meters. We actually have to be able to do that. And then we tie together what rainfall actually exists. When we tie the 2 together, we get that graph that I showed you previously, and we're able to quantify how much II actually exists in a given area. As you can see here in the picture, we've blanketed the region of Peel with flow meters and rain gauges. We have over 350 flow meters currently installed. We have targets to hit 400 by the end of the year. And the beauty of this, it allows us to actually measure those flows and know where are our problem areas and where do we need to focus our action on. So how do we pinpoint our sources? Primarily, we put cameras in pipes. It's robotics at its finest here. And the picture at the top left gives you an idea of what we do, or what a camera inside a pipeline looks like. And the picture on the top right gives you an idea of a type of defect that we could find with those cameras. What we've also started doing this year, and this is new in 2019, is we have our crews actually working at wet weather events. And we've done a lot of work already in 2019, and the bottom right 2 pictures give you a good example of what we find during that wet weather. You can see the maintenance hole there gushing with water into it. That looks good under a normal dry weather day. You don't see the II unless you're looking in wet weather. So a big part of our strategy says, go look at it when it's raining. Another big method we use here is called smoke and dye dusting, where we introduced a harmless type of smoke into the sewers here, and we look for smoke coming out of defects. And this often mitigates itself or shows itself through smoke coming up through the ground, or out of catch basins, or out of people's downspout. And as you can imagine, this has to be closely worked with emergency services here, because we don't want them calling the fire truck. So we work closely with fire and emergency services during these events. And no, that's not a picture of what wastewater looks like. That's actually a dye that we use if we're not able to pinpoint those sources, where we introduce dye into a suspected improper connection to our sewer, and then we observe it coming into the sanitary sewer system. If we see it, we instantly know it exists. Maintenance hole inspection is also a big part of our program here, because as you saw by the picture, a big part of where II comes from is from those defects in maintenance holes. In the last 4 years, we've inspected almost 7,000 with a very new procedure that's very, very specific towards targeting II in terms of the defects we found, and we identified almost 600 of those 6,000, so about 10% of them. This is an example of one of our high II areas. This is actually right here in the region. We're up there in the top star right now. That's one of our problem areas is right here where the region offices is. What we do next is, once we've been able to quantify and identify where that II is let's put a strategy together towards fixing it. Is it rehabilitating or is it doing something else? One of the biggest things we've done over the last 2 years is develop a set of new capital standards which very aggressively targets II in our system, either through sealing maintenance holes, as you can see here. And we've spent a lot of time with the industry, engaging with our Contractors Association too, and monitoring that progress. We're also in the progress of updating those based on the lessons learned we've had already to date. This is a couple of photos of our new standards in action here. You can see our sealing manholes here in the top left corner. One of the biggest aspects of our new pipeline standard is constructing sanitary infrastructure similar to water mains. So that means they can accept that pressure without breaking apart, or they don't let water in during dry periods or drain groundwater. The picture in the top right is a new development in Northwest Brampton where we've implemented sealing all those joints on the outside here. So, rehabilitating is, of course, our biggest target, and this is a challenging project where we found high II down in City of Mississauga Ward 2, and this work was completed in 2018. In the top left here, you can see what an actual maintenance hole looked like during a wet weather event, absolutely gushing with water. And you can see that same maintenance hole in the top right, what it looked like after our work is complete. The biggest outcomes that we found here, and this is a picture of what the inside of that pipeline looks like after we relined it. You can see the gaps here, and you can see the removal of that infiltration that was coming in. The biggest message here, and I apologize for the bit of confusion, but you can see on the on the bottom left, this is what the flow characteristics look like in that pipeline before we did our work. When it rained, you could see the peak that we saw in the flow in that sewer. So it went from 10 liters per second all the way to 50 as soon as it started raining. After our work, you can see here on the right, during a similar rainfall event, that flow went down to about 15 liters per second. Significant outcome related to this work. But fixing I&I isn't always feasible. The picture here shows you what happens if we remove downspouts, a known I&I issue here when we have downspouts connected to our sanitary sewers. When we're working in high density areas, this causes significant icing. We don't want to generate a community issue from our II related work. So sometimes we have to do something different. We must accept and then manage that II contribution. How do we do that? We can do two things. We can divert flows around problem areas, or we can store it. We can create secondary larger pipelines or tankage where excess flows that are in our sewers flow in and we store them, and then when the event is over, they slowly release themselves down to the treatment plant. Peel has really quickly adopted this strategy. We have a number of major projects underway here, primarily in Lower Mississauga, Councillor Daska. We have a number of, in your ward, in Councillor Fonseca's ward, along Cawthra as well. So we have a number of these relief-type projects already initiated to address II. Our strategy wouldn't be complete, of course, without a resident program, because a significant part of our work, of course, originates from private side, and that includes our downspouts that are connected. The region's current program is voluntary only. We blanketed the region with this standard or this voluntary program, and we gave people upwards of $100 per house to disconnect their downspouts. Unfortunately, the uptake of that has been about 4% to date, so really not effective. What do we want to move to, and what is our strategy recommended, is a focused type downspout program where we're actually targeting these problem areas and those problem areas only, not blanketing the entire region if it's not necessary. We intend to have a contractor and a consultant fully support us in the development of standards and then the rollout of this program. The cost is definitely more per household, but our projections are the uptake will be much larger. What's important to recognize already is our bylaw does specifically prohibit this, so we want to work with the community to be able to disconnect these downspouts. And in my opinion, the picture on the left, they don't all have to be ugly. Our resources, our strategy did identify a significant resource requirement internally. We currently only have approximately 1.5 FTEs working on this program. Although the strategy identified 4 FTEs, our intent is to move forward with 2 contract positions this year, primarily to roll out our downspout disconnection program in the top 3 areas. We do have significant amount of capital planned over the next 4 years related to this program. In the future, this is where us engineers really like a challenge here. Our intent is to develop a system that we can actually control. You can see the top right picture here. This is a great analogy when we're actually been able to use Environment Canada and National Weather Service data to actually quantify exact amount of rainfall that falls across the region, not just that falls within our rain gauges. And we can actually quantify that and assess really what happens region-wide. So we're working with a number of other local municipalities, conservation authorities to implement this program. Our intent is to move to a fully controlled system where we incorporate our monitoring, our flow monitoring, and a strategy where we can aggressively move wastewater around the system and know exactly what's going on in any given time to prevent basement flooding as much as possible. In summary, addressing II will certainly take a lot of time. We've got a great plan in place here. Not all II can be removed, but we have to have a plan to deal with that. We certainly have a significant investment in our capital program along with this, and our program certainly aligns with what we're doing in our enterprise asset management program. With that, I thank you very much for your attention.
And you've generated quite a few questions. Councillor Fortini.
Thank you, through the chair. Just a couple of questions. If we go on slide number 7, so we're going to see that we got sanitary and storm sewers. There's a lot of areas, I know in my area, they don't have that. They only have one, right? So when we do the roads, I understand you cannot put a sanitary sewer because you got to connect it around the weeping tiles and bring everything back, or put a backwash valve. We ever think of putting bigger pipes when we do our sewers and give it more flow?
Absolutely. We could, Councillor, sorry, through the chair. We could implement larger, but that would mean going to a combined system, Councillor. And as you know, a combined system is what many municipalities are going away from. It would actually be, in my opinion, beneficial to construct a stormwater system for those areas rather than oversizing the sanitary. But you're correct in saying it is problematic because all that flow is overland now. Does that make sense?
Well, and I get what you're saying. You cannot, I think, you cannot put an extra pipe because you got to connect every house around the weeping tile, the downspout, and so that means breaking everyone's lawn. But putting the bigger pipe on the road,
yes,
it's like having, you got a 2-inch sink, you got 3 inches of water going, sooner or later it's going to flow.
Absolutely.
So if you have most of those roads, I know where I live, there's a 10-inch pipe or a 12-inch pipe. Sooner or later, when that fills, the lower houses back in and it goes into their pipes. Even if you do that, it comes through if you have a shower or washroom downstairs. Putting bigger pipes on the road when they actually do the water mains and restore them, from a 12-inch, maybe put 18 inches to give it more flow.
Through the chair, one of the concepts we have here, Councillor, is in challenging areas where we have issues like that, that goes to our storage concept. Put a bigger pipe and store the flow into that pipe during high events. Right. There's lots of different ways to look at that technically. Your solution is certainly valid. The challenge we have is the cost, of course, to do that. If the area is very large, it may actually be cheaper to go back and connect these people or give them some pumps where they could pump to a higher level storm. It does introduce, you can start to see some of the challenges with dealing with II. Certainly has its community challenges.
The sub pumps would be a lot. I think backwash valve would be a lot more cheaper. Yeah. I know my area got flooded. I didn't, but I ended up putting one in. And I think, for $1,000, you could actually put a backwash valve so long as you train or educate the resident. If it's raining, you can't have a shower and have a dishwasher because you're just going to flood yourself out when the door closes. My other question, you look at the pipes. they're way below the footings because of your slope for your sewer line. How do they break down there when you're like 10 to 12 feet deep? Now, I get around the catch bases. People say the catch bases move. It's not the catch bases. It's around it because of the heat. That's what moves up and down the frost, because those go deep. But how did they manage to break that 12 feet deep?
Through the chair, you'd be surprised how many instances we see, and typically we have a little bit of movement in the joint, or over time you get ununiform compaction. If the compaction wasn't done uniformly across that pipe, you will get mid-span breakage of a pipeline. We've had many instances of that, and it typically goes back to quality of construction.
Yeah, and I get it, because usually the pipe's round. When it's round, it's really
Very
around the
strong.
hose of pressure, and it's very hard to break one of those pipes on the round. It's not a square that it makes a dent. Have we ever looked at even the catch bases on the roads? You know, you go up and down and you jump. They have these type, I see them in Switzerland. You open your catch base, you adjust your screws, and it's like an oval, and they can lower it and down instead of always digging out the catch base and repatching it.
In terms of like repairing them?
Repairing them.
Yes.
On the roads.
And we've done a number of instances, and our new standard has that, where we actually can use wedges type arrangements, where we reset the frame to accommodate the slope in the road. There's all kinds of wonderful technical things our engineers can do.
Very good.
But you're absolutely right. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Councillor Groves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Anthony, thank you for your presentation, and congratulations on your new position. I'm sure you're going to do great. Also, thank you for taking a proactive approach. I remember when you first came to us with approving monies in the budget for this program, I thought it was a great program, and especially given the amount of rainfall that we've been having over the last few years. And when you look at the weather forecast all across Ontario or Canada, you can see the reason and the need for doing something like this. The question that I do have is, Councillor Fortini was talking about some of his areas that flooded, and I have an area in Bolton where we are in the floodplain. So how would you address this in that floodplain area? I know you talked about some pumps and all the other stuff, but how would we do that?
Through the chair, Councillor, you have a very good point there, and especially with the recent flooding that your ward experienced this past spring. We actually did quite the assessment of course, within Bolton community, we have numerous flow meters, and we did assess the II contribution during that event. Our sanitary sewer system actually performed very well during that particular event. That doesn't mean we're oblivious to the work that needs to be done. And typically what we do, if we do have an area that's inside a floodplain, we will develop our system to be 100% sealed. You can't even open a manhole conventionally because it needs proper equipment to be able to remove. And with that sealing process on the outside, it doesn't really care if there's 4 feet of water on top, it's not getting in. So that's how we attack those type of areas. We do know with changing climate change that floodplains are going from this big to this big, and that certainly has a big impact on our sanitary system that tends to exist in valleys. That's the way we used to build. So it is a significant work area that we're focused on.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And I know that the TRC, and I'm sure CVC, they are doing flood mapping, and they're updating their mapping for floodplains and that. Are you working with them to look at those areas? Because then that would mean that those are the areas you would want to focus and do some more of what you just talked about.
Through the chair, absolutely, Councillor. We have been working with them. We're even working with them on our radar work as well. They're very interested in that, of course, because it supplements the data they already use. So that is part of our program.
Okay, that's great. And final question is, once we do these repairs and we do the sealing and make sure that the surcharges, water isn't getting in to the sanitary, what would be the lifespan on those?
Through the chair, our intent as staff is a minimum of 50 years. We will continue to monitor our system, of course, and do touch-ups as be required, but we see no reason as staff that we can't make our infrastructure last a minimum of 50 to 100 years.
Well, I want to thank you again, Anthony, for taking that proactive approach, that you're not reacting to this, because it might be a significant amount of money that we're investing in doing these rehabilitation and repairs. But at the end of the day, I think it's a lot cheaper than replacing the whole sewer system and that. So thank you to you and your team for looking ahead.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. My comments are more by way of complimenting and recognizing Anthony for his excellence and commitment to this particular field. He would easily qualify as a wastewater wizard, because he takes this, of all the staff I've dealt with on the ground, and they've all been good, but this guy takes it to the next level. So I don't know whether, I'm glad he picked this as a career, not something else, but everything I've ever dealt with him, yeah, I can't say enough about this gentleman as far as the quality of his work. My only question is, on account of I don't know everything, because mostly I ask you, what % of this incorrect water or other products are currently making it into our system, either sanitary or regular stormwater? Like, are we trying to get 10% of the system, or 15 or something, or I'm not sure. What do you reckon, how much leakage do we got?
Through the chair, Councillor, it's a great question, and thank you for your remarks, much appreciated. Our intent depends strategically on the problem area. We have some areas that I can increase flows by 200%. In those areas, my intent is to get 80 to 90% out of it if we possibly can. We'll see. What we're going to continue to do, the important part is measurement. We are going to continue to gauge our success in those areas against how we perform on our flow meter system. And my intent is we'll be back here in another year to report more successes like we did in the Lornwood Creek example.
Okay. All right, well, that was my only question, and I don't want to keep wishing him luck. He doesn't need it, and just hope he never retires. So thanks very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, George. Councillor Kovac.
Yeah, thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, Anthony, thank you for not just the presentation, but for the report, which was very informative. Also appreciated the presentation. Just on the downspout connection part or disconnection part, some confusion amongst my constituency related to that, whereby I've had residents say at one point we were being encouraged to connect, and now you're telling us to disconnect. Which is it, Kovac? I've gotten that. At some point in the past, maybe even in the recent past, were we encouraging on some level here at the region for residents to be connecting rather than disconnecting?
Through the chair, to my knowledge, Councillor, we never did that as a municipality. The challenges we have are obvious in the picture, as you know. When we have mixed-use residential or medium or high-density residential, the II factors are tremendous. We have heated parking garages and basement parking garages. All that water gets pumped to sanitary. So when that land use changes, there's more impact on us. To my knowledge, we've never done that as a municipality. Our bylaw actually prohibits that. I would rather work with the community and understanding where the challenges are and come up with a different solution, because surcharging our system is not the solution. So connectivity would make the problem worse. And in my opinion, you're just transferring it from one person and you're flooding your neighbor's basement. That doesn't benefit any of us. So to my knowledge, we've never done that, or we won't do that.
Now, I was very curious, you mentioned it in the presentation, about 4% uptick. It's very low.
Yes.
You think it's maybe not, is it lack of education? Is it confusion over exactly what it would entail? Do we need to look at more of a reward system? Do people need to be rewarded with a higher amount of money potentially, or what will do it? I know the proposal is to make it mandatory where it's paramount that we have disconnection done, but you think, what do you think?
Yeah, through the chair, I think the problem is people like the status quo. They don't like downspouts running off onto their lawns. It affects their neighbors, onto their driveways. It is an inconvenience. And we recognize that as staff. However, that's why we're changing our approach. From a voluntary, I think we did a great job of promoting it. The uptake just wasn't there because there wasn't a desire. So our approach is, let's focus that in problem areas only. Let's not do the whole region. Let's just assess where we have the problem and do the work there. And then let's take the burden off our residents. let the region do the work. We'll come up with a great set of standards to make this happen that they'll be happy with. Not the level of the picture I showed there, I hope, but something in the interim that we can work with the residents and say, hey, if you don't want to disconnect, we kind of have a bylaw and you're transferring the problem to your neighbor. That's not really fair. So that's the intent here. We're certainly will be rolling that out in a little bit more detail to each one of you in the specific areas we're working on.
And then what's being proposed in relation to that, the outreach piece that would come from regional staff and Public Works?
Through the chair, absolutely,
outreach.
yes.
Excellent. I want to echo Councillor Carlson's comments. Anytime I've ever had to come to you with anything, not just an answer right away, automatic, but so impressive, your focus, your innovation, your dedication, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Raz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's a Love-In for Anthony Day. That's awesome. That never happens around here. Thank you for the information, Anthony, and I know that we've had a lot of issues down in Ward 2 over the last few years, but I will congratulate the team on the realignment for Lornwood Creek. For those of you who don't know, we had a sewer pipe that was basically falling apart, but it was in a valley and we couldn't get heavy equipment in there. So we went, the region went in and did put a sleeve in the creek, in the pipe that rested in the creek, so it created minimal disruption for everybody. But because it was in a fairly well-to-do area, there would be some disruptions, so we had to have a couple community meetings on it. But once the work started, I think people had an appreciation for the work that went on, so thank you for the crew for that. Can you go back to the slide where when we look at the scope of the problem, you identified 3 priority or different targeted areas within there it is. So this targeted area, I see priority number 1. Most of it is part of the west side of Ward 2. I know that there's currently work undergoing right now. Does this include the work that's going to be targeted to the residents for the mandatory program?
Through the chair, first of all, thank you. Our staff was really amazing on Lornwood Creek. They did an incredible job. We're really, really proud of that outcome. It shows the program works. Specific to your question, Councillor, absolutely, this will be, Park Royal is the infamous II area in the entire region of Peel. Farshad, our II advisor sitting behind me, has blanketed this area with flow meters on virtually every street. I've personally gone out there with our CCTV crews, and on the driest of day, those sewers are all flowing clear. So we have a bit of work to do there. Some is on private side, some is a little bit of mix on connections, improper connections these were at the time of the house building. So certainly Area 1 is not just Area 1 because of a number, it's Area 1 because of its challenges that we've faced.
Okay, and I'm happy to work with staff to help get the word out and have community meetings before we take those next steps. I know that when the last time we rolled out the program, there was there was some confusion about how they would do it, the impacts on their neighbors, and in some areas where they had the sloped fronts or sloped sides, or if they're on a slight hill where that water would go to. So there's a lot of work to do. So it may be more expensive per household, but you're right, I like identifying those target areas that are going to have the biggest impacts. And I think that was it. So thank you very much again. And I'm happy to go on another plant of the Clarkson Water Treatment, or plant tour of the Clarkson Water Treatment Plant. It's fascinating.
Okay, super.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fortini.
Thank you, through the chair. Sorry, Anthony, a couple more questions. So our city of Brampton, we've been arguing over driveways that are too wide. So water's going inside the drains. And the most argument is they gotta leave 2 feet from the property line in the front, about 6 feet away from the house, and all along the side, and in the back, you're allowed all concrete. So if we're worried about that water in the front only, the water in the back usually, when you do a patio or something, it's sloping towards the back, it's not sloping towards your house. It goes in a swale. The swales have the catch base. Those are connected to the road. So do we have a certain bylaw that we could actually say you're only allowed, you gotta leave 50% of green space so the water penetrates in the ground?
Through the chair, Councillor, the challenge with that aspect is it's stormwater related.
Right.
I'd love to get involved. We, right now, kind of don't have the mandate to do that, but would we do that? That's the challenge from a disconnection standpoint, is that when you do disconnect a downspout, it makes that problem worse. So that's a challenge for us at the region side. Have we worked with our colleagues at Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon on the stormwater issue? Absolutely. We've actually worked very aggressively with Mississauga on some cross connections we have. Unfortunately, in your specific issue, the region can't really mandate that as part of our development standards. It would have to, it's something we could work with the city on.
Well, that was my second question. So if we're allowing a whole backyard all concrete on the side of the house, and we're telling the residents to disconnect the downspout, that water is coming back in our catch bases, which is coming in my basement because my street has one sewer, right, and it overflows. Because now there's the rain, the way it happens now, it comes down very quick in an hour, and then it kind of dries up. Our pipes can't handle that flow all at once. So do you ever think we're going to come back with a backwash valve program again?
Through the chair, Councillor, we do actually have a backwater program included in our II. I didn't focus on that for a couple of reasons. We actually have a subsidy. We have a subsidy amount that we provide to people. Again, our intent is that only be in problem areas. The problem with backwater valves, they're a maintenance challenge for the homeowner. You can imagine it's a one-way valve, and when you have reverse flow, that closes. So all your wastewater is flowing over that valve every day. If you don't maintain that when you really need it, it may not work. Our intent with backwater valves, keep the program, but if we really cannot find a solution, then backwater valve is the answer.
Well, the backwash valve, I'm talking the one inside, not the one outside you pull up.
Oh,
The one that
okay.
has a door,
Okay.
it's a hatch that you could actually look and you can see the screws. But when they came, so we come up with this backwash valve, I remember in the past, and the program, the region gives the money to people, but then the city, it costs more for a permit and all, so people don't do it.
Okay.
So what happens is they're installing it without permits, and then without a permit, you don't get the back. So this is still causing a problem for people that really wanted to install it, but saying, you know, it's no sense getting it. I don't know if you're going to answer this one. What do you think, with your experience, concrete pipes or plastic pipes with PVC?
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor McFadden. I'm a firm believer in there's an application for every single piece of hardware out there.
You don't want to answer. I've been doing this for a long time, so I know. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Dasco.
Thank you, and through the chair, I just want to say thank you, Anthony. Every time I hear you talk about this, you can hear that you've got a passion for this, and I'm always learning something new. It's a whole different world I never knew existed until you started talking about this. One thing I just wanted to ask about is, with the 5% or less than 5% uptake on this whole thing, I know that in my ward, there's several people that have had issues where they're disconnecting now, all of a sudden they're pointing their downspouts in the wrong direction. They're going into neighbors' driveways, into window wells, all this other kind of stuff. Is there any thought that we might have that we would do some messaging out there in terms of how to do it properly? The benefits of it, and also how to do it properly, because also just a few months ago we had somebody that actually came to council in Mississauga, but one of their problems was the neighbor next door who had just rebuilt their house had pointed their downspout right onto the driveway, and so it was spewing on there, and he was quite upset. And just wondering if maybe if we look at doing some more, whether it's social media messaging or something like that, if it goes out with people's water bills or something like this.
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor. Yes, we totally agree here, and this is one of our planned programs is we don't want to set people loose. We want to develop a standard and build it for them so that doesn't happen. Or at least we also recognize, as much as we want a downspout disconnected, that one doesn't make sense, and we need to accept it. So part of our new strategy says, do it focused, do it contractor-based, don't inconvenience your people, and then develop a set of standards so we don't have problems with what you're saying there. But your point is well taken. Yeah.
And Councillor Vicente.
Thank you, through you, Chair.
How deep typically are the stormwater sewers under the surface of the street?
Through the chair, that ranges, Councillor, absolutely. Depending, your standard residential, you know, your storm sanitary can be 2-3 meters deep, very shallow. In some areas in the region, we have sanitary sewers over 120 feet of depth. So it ranges depending. Our intent here, we love the topography of the region appeal from the lake up to the top of Brampton, and we leverage that to convey wastewater, whether that's storm or sanitary, at the most efficient cost we possibly can. And sometimes that just means we'll be deeper, but it does range.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, do you have situations in the region where the storm sewer piping isn't set deep enough in order to be able to accommodate the needs of what the residents may require to manage stormwater?
Through the chair, although we're venturing into stormwater, absolutely, yes. There's instances of both, of one not being deep enough occasionally, which can contribute to challenges. If you have a sump pump in your basement, sometimes it's because your storm sewer is so high that you can't convey your weepers by gravity. It needs to be pumped. It's often, you know, set because of that gravity concept that we don't want to pump if we don't have to.
So in a situation like that, it becomes then the homeowner's responsibility in order to push water up to the required level. Is that correct?
Through the chair, Councillor, 100% correct. I have one in my house.
Okay.
I love maintaining my pumping station in the basement for some reason.
I have no doubt that your pumping station is the most sophisticated, high-tech, and well-maintained in all of the region. As just a follow-up question, what happens in situations where, even like on a small residential street with small homes, you have land elevations in people's yards that become flooded all year round, especially in the spring and summer months? And they are not able, for example, to have the option of getting that water to a storm and water sewer unless they're pumping it. In other words, the elevation is lower. The elevation in the backyard is lower than the front street stormwater pipe.
Through the chair, Councillor, if your residents do experience that, I would say that is an issue that should be brought up to the municipality, whether that's the local or at the regional level, to be addressed, because that's a grading issue. And that probably shouldn't have been designed like that, or someone modified a draining system, you know, the drainage within their lots, that now it's causing that situation. I can assure you, the original signing engineer did not intend for that to happen. So there's something that caused that, and the municipality should be aware to address that.
So I don't want to labor members here with particular details, but I'd love to offline with you and discuss with you a unique situation we have in Brampton.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's the end of my list, and I have a resolution now before me, moved by Councillor Vicente. Oh, he's not in the room. Moved by Councillor Vicente, sorry, I meant Fortini. Councillor Vicente, who is in the room, and Councillor McFadden. It reads that the Commissioner of Public Works be authorized to replace the existing voluntary downspout disconnection program, with a mandatory contractor-supported program beginning in the 11 pilot focus areas only for 2019 and continuing in future years as approved by Council in yearly budgets. You've heard the motion. All those in favor by way of a recorded vote. Councillor McFadden has voted, yeah. And that carries. And as I go to items 8.2 and 8.3, and before we go on camera, I just want to remind you all we're just sort of teetering around the quorum level, so we'll keep moving right along, if I may suggest. We're on to item 8.2, Peel Public Health Strategic Priorities for the Future related to item 17.1, presentation by Dr. Jessica Hopkins, our Medical Officer of Health. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Today I'm presenting highlights from our recently completed 2019 Comprehensive Health Status Report, as well as other work that will inform our strategic priorities to support public health for 2020 and beyond. The collection, analysis, and reporting of health status data to key stakeholders is a requirement of the Ontario Public Health Standards. And as I've mentioned in my previous presentations around public health unit modernization, one of the key elements to have a strong public health sector, regardless of the structure, is keeping the local in local public health. But in order to do that, we actually have to understand our population. And that's what the Comprehensive Health Status Report does. It helps us to understand the current state of health outcomes and related risk factors for Peel residents. We've looked at health outcomes from 2008 to 2018 where available, and we highlight important issues to inform the next 10-year priorities for public health in Peel. The full report highlights many successes and positive changes in the health of Peel's residents. And there are some highlights that are provided here, and there are more in the executive summary that was in your packages on your desks today. We all know that Peel's population is growing, and it's growing very rapidly. We also know that our population is aging and that the 50 and over age group is going to be larger eventually than the younger age group. We also have a very richly diverse community with 52% of our population being born outside of Canada. We know that we're doing well with respect to life expectancy, and both men and women are living longer lives. We have high rates of immunization, and what that means is for those diseases that vaccines prevent, we have very low rates of those here in Peel. We've seen a decline in smoking rates, and in fact, Peel has one of the lowest smoking rates in all of Ontario. That's something we should be very proud of. And there's been a decline in chronic diseases, particularly heart and lung disease, and much of that is owed to the lower smoking rates. Through the report, we've also identified some emerging issues. We have seen some early indicators of the health impacts of climate change, and I spoke about Lyme disease and black-legged ticks in Peel region last council meeting. So that's certainly an area that we're keeping an eye on. As well, there's an increased rate of emergency department visits for mental health conditions in youth and young adults, particularly related to substance misuse, anxiety, and mood disorders. And we have some areas of opportunity. As you know already, we have high rates of diabetes in Peel. One of the interesting findings is that we are seeing an increase in those aged 20 to 49 years of age. Traditionally, diabetes tends to be in the 50 and over age group. We also know that we have a number of preventable cancers. So 1,200 cancer diagnoses from 2003 to 2012 were a result of infectious diseases, including human papillomavirus, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C. And we do expect to see lower rates of human papillomavirus and hepatitis B as our vaccination programs roll out over many years. We haven't made much improvement on physical activity, healthy eating, or sedentary behavior. So those are all areas that we'll continue to work on. To refresh your memory, this is our current Peel Public Health Strategic Plan, and I presented in more detail on the progress with that back in February when we did the council orientation meeting. Our three program areas that we focus on are nurturing the next generation, which focuses on the early years of life, supportive environments for healthy living, which ties into your term of council priority, age-friendly built environments, and living tobacco-free. So why are we looking at a new strategic plan right now? Well, our current strategic plan ends at the end of 2019, which is fast approaching. We are required under the Ontario Public Health Standards, all health units in Ontario must have a strategic plan to guide their work. We also know that our community has grown and changed over the last 10 years, and we need to look at new evidence and trends to inform that. And that's what the Comprehensive Health Status Report has really allowed us to do. This plan was significantly under development when the province announced its modernization plans for public health in Ontario. And we really see this as an opportunity now that regardless of what the structure looks like, we can use this as a way to advocate for what the true needs of the residents are within Peel. We're very proud of the rigorous process we used to develop these emerging priorities. So we started by looking at the data, the Comprehensive Health Status Report, and what the needs are. But we've also done extensive consultation with stakeholders, including other Region of Peel departments, the municipalities and staff in municipalities, LHINs, hospitals, school boards, community health centers, conservation authorities, police services, and many more. We also spoke with clients who use our services and staff because they are on the front lines and they know what the needs are in the community. So that's resulted in 4 priorities that are emerging. And the first is mental well-being. So how we can support Peel residents to maintain and promote their mental health, chronic disease prevention with a focus on physical activity, healthy eating, and decreasing sedentary behavior. the health impacts of climate change and how we can reduce exposures to hazards and mitigate related adverse health outcomes, and health equity, how we better define public health's role in identifying and reducing health inequities. So today we are recommending that the Board of Health Regional Council endorse Peel Public Health's emerging topic areas. And if you do, our next steps would be to finalize the emerging topic areas into strategic priorities, and we would report back to Council in the fall. And we really see this work being able to influence the new regional public health entity to adopt the strategic priorities once they're finalized so that we can meet the public health needs of Peel residents. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have questions. Councillor Santos.
Thank you so much through you, Chair. Thank you, Doctor, for the report and the presentation. Councillor Vicente and I were just visiting and touring Peel Public Health yesterday, the ins and outs of everything that you do. And so this is really not really a question. It's really just a comment to say thank you for all the work that you and your team do. Obviously, preventative measures that Peel Public Health get into are sometimes intangible. You don't see it until a lot later. And the successes that are highlighted here are, you've shared some of those successes, and certainly we support Peel Public Health, what you do, and I'm happy to move the recommendations forward.
Thank you. And it has been moved by Councillor Santos, seconded by Councillor Vincente, that the Peel Board of Health Regional Council endorse Peel Public Health emerging strategic topic areas as outlined in Section 2A of the report of the Commissioner of Health Services and the Medical Officer of Health titled Peel Public Health Strategic Priorities for the Future. You've heard the motion, and I need a recorded vote, please, if you'd push your buttons accordingly. And that carries. Thank you. That brings me to our last staff presentation, 8.3, Regional Council Public Awareness Campaign on Provincial Budget Cuts, as requested at the May 9th meeting, presented by Bethany Lee, Manager of Strategic Client Communication. Bethany, welcome.
Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Bethany Lee, and I am the Manager of Communications, and I'm happy to be here this afternoon to present a communication strategy in response to the provincial budget cuts for discussion and endorsement. At the last meeting of Council, it feels so far away now, we were asked to report back on a strong, wide-reaching campaign to raise awareness to all residents on the potential of the impacts of provincial funding cuts and how residents might be directly impacted. As the issue is complex, most residents may not have a good understanding of exactly how the budget cuts may impact them. And we will ensure that the language that we use in the campaign is simple, the messages are compelling, action-oriented, and factual. The campaign will focus on 4 points: awareness, consequences, opposition, and action. When we heard from you at the last meeting, you asked us to engage with Peel residents. That's our primary audience, as well as the Premier of Ontario, Peel MPPs, and media. Our secondary audiences, obviously, are Marco, Amo, various leaders within the community. We would love to have their voice as part of this discussion, and staff. So how will we tell the story? We'll start with very plain language. Cuts hurt people. When you take funding away from essential programs, services will be lost or taxes will go up. Provincial cuts don't save money. One way or another, residents will pay. Our call to action is to call for the province to stop the cuts. And you'll see the hashtag there, cuts hurt people. Our focus is very much on the people, and you'll see that in the creative in a moment. So I'll take you through our first example. The image on your screen is an overall example of the design that we would use during the campaign. You'll see the headline, Cuts Hurt People. In the campaign, the focus is on those people who may be impacted by service. In some cases, it's staff. In some cases, it's residents. When funding is taken away from essential programs, services will be lost or taxes will go up. It's that simple. We then state one way or another residents will pay for provincial cuts, and our call to action closes with go online now and ask the province to work with us to stop the cuts. The tone, as you'll see, is serious, immediate, and action-oriented. You will see here in this second example in your package that the focus is on the patient, the resident who could be impacted. We'll use different images throughout the campaign, and we'll talk a little bit about phasing in a moment. The call to action always remains the same, and the website landing page will be branded and easy to recall and share. Here we see a young child, another resident who may be impacted by funding loss. As we grow the campaign, budget changes or milestones which we are approaching or which we reach, specific examples of cuts related to these milestones can be phased in and used to draw attention to that specific area of interest. Finally, we will complement the design execution with this type of creative with an appeal for a balanced approach. The designs we will develop in this stream call out to the balance that the region is seeking when working with the province. So our proposed tactics or channels, this is the way, how will we tell this story? So I referred to the website and an email form. This is where we will ask residents to engage with us, to go online and participate and send emails to the Premier and the MPP. The example on your package and on the screen is from the recent DC charges campaign. It will look a little bit different, but essentially function the same. The region will receive that information as well so that we will have record on the sentiments and the information being captured. During that last campaign, we simply sent a few tweets and had the page posted for just a few days, and we know that over 600 emails went through that system. Next is our social media and our Connect to Peel. You may be familiar. We will be sending a special edition of Connect to Peel, and that will direct everybody to the campaign as well as the town halls that I'll be speaking about in a moment. The Twitter as well will be flooded with these messages once we get started. Connect to Peel currently reaches over 117,000 residents' email addresses, and our corporate Twitter account has over 24,000 followers. Of course, through your retweets and sharing, we hope to amplify these messages. The telephone town halls were mentioned at the meeting last. We've researched this. This is a unique way to reach residents. It's a two-way communication method where we can gather information from residents, and it reaches residents where they are. We are hoping to go forward with 2 date options to connect with as many residents as possible, and we take a little bit of time in advance to promote this option. One thing that we have found that is quite helpful is a counselor toolkit. We would be happy to provide that to you. Of course, all of the key messages, FAQs, sample tweets, and campaign materials would be included for you. Tracking and measurement, of course, is very important. We want to make sure that we're reaching as many people as possible, engaging with them, and having good conversation. As well, working with our friends in the media, we would be following our media coverage, the sentiment, social campaign statistics, the send out through Connect to Peel. We can look at how many people are engaging and track that data. As well, the robust data that we would receive from the telephone town hall. Thank you.
Thank you. And there are questions. Mayor Brown.
Okay, I think this is a good starting point. As I mentioned before, we're behind the 8 ball in terms of the advocacy that we've seen from other parts of the province, particularly from the City of Toronto, highlighting to the residents the real cost of these cuts. A few things I'd like to see amended. In terms of the images, you don't see what is being cut. You don't see how it affects people's lives. A few things I'd like to see is, what does this downloading mean on your regional tax bill? So, Toronto has pointed out it's 6% on the City of Toronto's tax bill, what is the amount in dollar and percent on the regional bill? That needs to be included in one of those slides. In terms of, we got photos of children. Well, if it's a childcare space being lost, say how many childcare spots will be lost. If it's a slide of a paramedic, say how many paramedics could potentially, what service, what jobs are being lost, what service for people is being lost. We have to be specific. People want to know how it affects their lives. And they're so busy right now with their own responsibilities. When they see this tweet or this social media ad, we need to be specific and blunt in that moment that they take a look at this. Enough to motivate them to send a note, to send an email. Some of the cuts, as we learned in the briefing, just don't make a lot of sense. And to highlight the ones that really confound logic, I think is appropriate. The one I pointed out last time was the prisoner transport. And so that should be on the slides, that the province no longer wants to pay for prisoner transport. What do you want to do with the service? And so obviously it's a statutory obligation, and so it shows they're essentially simply downloading responsibilities. But they need to be specific, because right now the province is saying we just want municipalities to be leaner. We want them to cut fat. This is, what we're downloading on them is just fat. They've said fat when it comes to public health units. Well, explain to the public what this so-called fat is. Prisoner transport is not fat. The average resident gets that. And as we've seen with the water campaign, as we've seen with advocacy by parents with children with autism, this is a government that does react when it comes to effective campaigns that generate public interest. And that's why I think this is important. I want to mention on the town hall, it can't be simply one that you call into. That gets a low turnout. It needs to be one where there's a call out. So I assume that was a given. You would provide both options. You call every number, but you also create a number that you can call into, and that's how you get a wide participation. How many followers does the Region Appeal Twitter account have and Facebook page?
Through you, the chair. So Twitter, I think, is 24,000. Facebook is actually, it was dormant, so we're looking at launching that right now.
So how many residents do we have in the Region Appeal?
Yeah, we're working to acquire new followers every day.
About 1.4 million. And the reason I asked that question, which I think was self-explanatory, is putting this ad and this great content that you're going to be building on a dormant Facebook page will not achieve the necessary penetration in terms of visibility and awareness. And same thing with Twitter. And so when we've had public awareness campaigns, if you look what the City of Toronto is doing, it has to be through social media ads. And whether we're spending 10 cents per resident to adequately build a public awareness campaign, I think it has to be done that way. If we're in a situation a year from now where you have 200,000 followers on your social media channels, that may not be necessary. But at the point right now where we don't have that, this campaign would have to coincide with a social media buy that would actually put this out there targeted towards Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon. And then I think you'd actually get high volumes of people emailing into their MPPs saying, this needs a second look. And so I'm not sure if that would take direction or a motion to add this to the campaign, but after this discussion, I would propose we go in that direction.
Thank you, and I'll come back to that. Councillor Santos.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Thanks very much for the update. Just a couple of things to add in addition to Mayor Brown's comments. Diversity and language translation, given how diverse our region is, specifically in Mississauga and Brampton as well. And agree with Mayor Brown around the social media and very specifically Facebook ad buys. We will have to boost 100%. And I think we will find that pretty effective. The other thing is, I know you have sample tweets for councillors. Wondering if we could provide a toolkit for residents and sample tweets for residents as well that include tags to the Premier, their local MPPs, and any ministers associated with it. And finally, if we're going to launch this campaign, if there is a launch date, I'd like for us to consider a media launch event similar to what Toronto did, and having as many of us there as possible to get that media attention as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Raz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would agree with the fellow speakers that if we can get more quantifiable examples so people can actually relate, I think that would be helpful. I like the graphics and the back end stuff. I do think we really, really need to leverage all of our partners, especially when it comes to Peel Police. Councillor SAITO noted that Peel Police have 175,000 followers. So I think between all the councillors here and some of our external partners, we can really leverage that. So I also note that I think a good visual, Mayor Brown, may be the new police boat that we have that I noticed Chair UNICCA and the local MPP last week were on the boat, and maybe we can suggest that this might be the new prisoner transport. So, I don't know. Up the Credit River.
The first prisoner?
So thank you very much for the presentation. I also don't think we can wait on this. So this is, I would continue you as though you forge ahead. We're almost there, but something is better than nothing at this point. So proceed as planned with a few tweaks. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Sorry, Mayor Thompson.
Thank you. Bethany, you've done an awesome job here, and I've seen the work that you've done for us at Caledon, and you've done a great job here at Peel, and congratulations on that. And the hashtag that you have, that it hurts people, I think is a really good one. But I think there's another one we can throw out there too, is provincial efficiencies are not paid by property taxes or picked up by property taxes, because I think we need to revert that their cuts are coming down on our property taxes if we have to keep that level of service. I think it hurts, but I think we also need to get that word tax, property tax in there to realize that they're putting the two and two together. But other than that, awesome job.
Thank you, and the clerk's just perfecting our resolution that will be moved by Mayor Brown and Councillor Raz. Oh, Councillor Raz, a further thought. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I did forget. I was at a resident town hall AGM last week, and I took portions of Norm's presentation that I gave the other week on the cuts and reductions. And the people in the crowd were dumbfounded, to say the least. They didn't have an appreciation for what this meant to our bottom line of the tax increase being over 4%. So I would encourage all the councillors here that are left to when they do have their public meetings or every public opportunity, to reinforce that message as well. So that it was a bit of an eye opener for my folks. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor SAITO.
Thank you. I want to support what Mayor Brown said about making the images much more impactful. And, you know, I was looking through the budget presentation that moving forward on the budget. And, I mean, the page that really says the most is the $81 per year, 4.1%. And that's before we even start looking at the budget. So, you know, we have those numbers. And numbers and money are what people always respond to. Tax increases is what they always respond to. I just tweeted out today that, you know, we got this information, and my comment was, send a thank you note to your MPP for the 4.1% tax increase next year. That's before we even start. So I think we need to be subtly, little tongue-in-cheek there. Yeah, let's thank them for the 4.1% before we even get going, and possible reduction in services. But I think we really need to nail it. You know, as Mayor Brown said, the picture of the little girl, cute picture, but it really doesn't tell a story. It doesn't say that daycare is being cut. You know, the prisoner, we were saying, how would they get there? And my colleague here had a good idea, send them an Uber. You know, I mean, you could really, you could really play this up. And because the idea is you want to attract You want people to read it. You want to attract it, not just, oh, it's just another message from the region of Peel whining about, or the, the cities whining about cuts and, they're spending all this money on this, that, and the other thing. So we need to really address it and make it very, very clear how it's going to impact residents and get that going as quickly as possible. And if there's some way that, I know this is on the regional budget, but we're all regional councillors as well as city councillors. And I was just doing a quick count. Brampton's Twitter account has 18,000. Mississauga has 65,000. Right there, you've got 83,000 followers who may not be the same people that are on the 24,000 of the region of Peel. So let's really try and cross-reference all of that and make sure that all of our, and I didn't look and see how many Caledon had, sorry. I just got to that. You have more than us? More than me?
No. I personally. I think we're
about
3,000.
About 3,000. Well, Caledon has a few more than I have because I have almost 3,000 personally. So there you go. We'll fight over that. Anyway, let's really make it a strong, impactful message.
Thank you. First the CFO, then back to Mayor Brown. Stephen?
Through the chair, thank you. I just wanted to provide a brief update to council on, we did get a funding announcement letter from the province with respect to cost-shared programs in public health as well as the seniors dental program. So as in our updates over the past couple of meetings, we talked about the likelihood of that the province would make us get back to 70% since they're only funding 63% of public health. Well, in fact, they actually gave us more than we expected. It's still a reduction. So overall, we're now at if we go out to 2021, the final impact is now still $40 million, so still unacceptable. But it's a 3.6% property tax impact versus 4.1 that we reported at the last meeting, and $71 a household, so that you've got the most current information.
And some guidance, I just think, on the campaign is really looking at the city of Toronto. If you look at the nature of their social media campaign, and I'd even suggest one thing that will garner awareness would simply be a letter summarizing all the points from the chair and possibly the three mayors to all the MPPs in Peel Region, just making sure that they're aware. I noticed that summary of the cost of the cuts in Toronto to the government MPPs in Toronto was impactful. And so if we could look into that, if there's a willingness of the chair to lead on that, and then have the mayors co-sign that request. But I know we're going to need that motion to authorize this campaign. And like Councillor Rass said, I do believe we're already behind the 8 ball on this. And so I wouldn't want us to wait another 2 weeks before we start this. Otherwise, it's going to be too late to have any effective advocacy. And so I think we sort of need to trust the final visuals to be presented to the chair. Trust that he'll be hands-on and make sure that they're the right balance, and then we proceed right away.
Thank you. Councillor Parrish.
My interest is tweaked by what Stephen said. What do we get for dental care?
I'm going to turn over to Jessica. She has the funding letter, I think.
I'm sorry,
handy.
seniors dental.
Seniors dental, right?
Through the chair, for seniors dental, the province has indicated we should plan that we will receive $3.9 million annually in 100% base funding. We have not yet received the funding letter.
That's fantastic, because we can up the number of people we serve, and I think I'd like to see a report come back to council on how we can allow people to go back a second and third time if it's required. I think that's really significant, and I'm really glad we started that. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hopkins, something further?
Through the chair, we will be bringing a report. We need to await details of the program, as we're not clear whether the eligibility criteria will be similar to ours or not. And so we'll bring all of that information back once we have details from the province.
Okay. That brings me to the resolution moved by Mayor Brown, seconded by Councillor Rass, that the public awareness campaign for Regional Council is contained in the report of the Commissioner of Corporate Services titled Regional Council Public Awareness Campaign on Provincial Cuts, including but not limited to social media ads and specific examples of impacts of cuts together with toolkits for residents and in a variety of languages, and leveraging partnerships for exposure be approved. And further, that the costs associated with the campaign be approved. Also, Mayor Brown, I take as direction something that can be penned for the chair that the mayors might co-sign with me. And let me also say that in discussing this earlier with staff as we were going through the agendas, I do have to point out the marvelous work that you, the three mayors actually, have done as advocates on the file, because you've served us very, very well, and you're very effective for your advocacy in your constituencies as well as the region. And I'm happy to play a supporting role in that regard, because I think between you, Bonnie, and Allan, you've nailed it. But it's a team effort, and we'll carry on. I hope that's got the essence of it.
Just,
Mayor Brown?
it does need to include the teletown hall, but there's always a cost to that as well. That's already
Okay.
Good.
Okay, so everybody is good with that? That being the case, it's been moved and seconded. I need a recorded vote. All those in favor, please punch the button accordingly. And that carries. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I think we may have tidied up the agenda in the following way. Councillor Santos was good enough over her lunch break to deal with item 9.1 that she's satisfied with, so I no longer need to deal with it now. So I take it on consent, but I do need a resolution on it. And the resolution moved by Councillor Santos, seconded by Councillor Sinclair, reads that the Region of Peel is duly authorized, signing officers be authorized to execute a service agreement with Our Place Peel for the provision of 20 emergency shelter beds and outreach services for youth 16 to 24 years of age for the period of 24 months in an amount not to exceed the upset limit of $2,600,000, excluding applicable taxes, in accordance with the procurement bylaw 30-2018 on business terms satisfactory to the Commissioner of Human Services and legal satisfactory to the legal satisfactory of the regional solicitor. You've heard the motion. I need a recorded vote. And that carries, which also brings me to the only other item we had, which was item 13.2, 2018 Treasury Report, and Councillor Santos is satisfied with that, so I would otherwise take that on consent unless anybody else wanted it addressed. If not, I need a show of hands that you're happy to deal with that on consent. That carries, thank you. And that takes me all the way down to item 18, Communications, Other Business. Yes, you're okay? Okay, yeah, you are correct, yes. Okay. I have a list, though, Councillors Parrish and SAITO under other business.
Under other
Councillor
business,
Parrish.
I would like to, is it here, or do we have to go in camera to deal with the appointment to the Police Services Board? In camera?
In camera, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Councillor SAITO.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have a question because I just received an email from a resident telling me that the region has mailed a card out to their townhouse complex inviting the residents to attend a public session to discuss the townhouse conversion to the carts. I'm not aware of any public meeting that has been scheduled in my ward. I'm not aware of this card, and as you know, council directed that the townhouse conversions be put on hold. The issue has not come back to council yet, so I'm extremely upset that regional staff, waste management staff, have moved ahead, invited residents to attend a public session to discuss it, and there has been no discussion with the council. I assume that this is probably happening in other wards as well. The letter just arrived today, apparently in their mailboxes. So I would like staff, well, first of all, I want to know why they went ahead and did this, and I want an explanation on that, and I want this stopped until it comes to council, as we directed last year. Should not have happened.
Yes, Councillor. Is staff in a position to give a response at this time? Is anybody aware of the file?
Yeah, through the chair, I will admit I'm not aware of the file, but I can certainly get to the bottom of it, get back to you, and get back to all of council.
Well, I just want to make sure that there's no public session held until council has given direction to move ahead with any conversions, which we have not done.
Okay, I'll get to the bottom, but that's a fair request.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Daskell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to give a particular shout out for we had I guess unanimously had passed the renaming of the Lakeview Water Treatment Plant to the Arthur Kennedy Water Treatment Plant. And I just wanted to mention that this Saturday is the actual event. So in case anybody had an interest and didn't know that it was this Saturday, that it is this Saturday morning, and we can certainly provide more details if you'd like, and hopefully everybody can make it out. It should be pretty exciting.
Looking forward to seeing you there. What a great cause. Wonderful. Okay, with that, that brings me down, if there's no other business, notices of motion, I have none. The next item that I have is the bylaws, moved by Councillors Kovac and Councillor Fortini, that the bylaw listed on the May 23rd, 2019 Regional Council agenda, being bylaw 36, 2019, be given the required number of readings, taken as read, signed by the regional chair and the regional clerk, and the corporate seal be affixed thereto. You've heard the motion. Show of hands. All those in favor? That is carried. That brings me down to in-camera matters, and I have two. So if everybody who otherwise is not necessary to be in camera, I'll thankfully ask you to make your way, and we will reconvene in camera.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to do a pit stop.
Okay. And we've come out of camera. We are back in session, and I move to the resolution stemming from the in-camera that have been moved by Councillor Parrish, seconded by Councillor Raz. One, that the in-camera report titled Legal Framework Governing Mandated Provision of Services by the Region, advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for the purposes listed as item 22.4 on the May 23 agenda, be received. Second, that the oral report of the Commissioner of Health Services be received. And finally, that Amada Tia be appointed as the citizen member of the Peel Regional Police Board to serve for a term ending on November 14th, 2022, or until a successor is appointed by the Region of Peel, and further, that the citizen member appointed to the Peel Police Services Board not exceed 2 terms of municipal council. I need a recorded vote. You've heard the resolution. Please vote accordingly. And I believe that was Councillor Parrish and Councillor Raz that moved and seconded that. And that carries. Thank you. Which brings me down to bylaw to confirm the proceedings of, oh, sorry. Go. Oh, sorry. One bylaw from the in-camera, correct? The bylaw from the in-camera that's been moved by Councillor Dasco, seconded by Councillor Carlson, that the bylaw relating to the in-camera item 22.3, being bylaw 37, 2018, be given the required number of readings, taken as read, signed by the regional chair and the regional clerk, and the corporate seal be affixed thereto. Is that show of hands? All those in favor? That is carried. I have a motion from Councillor Vicente and Mayor Thompson that the bylaw 38, 2019 to confirm the proceedings of Regional Council at its meeting held 23/19 and to authorize the execution of documents in accordance with the Region Appeal bylaws relating thereto be given the required number of readings, taken as read, signed by the regional chair and the regional clerk, and the corporate seal be affixed thereto. All those in favor, show of hands. That is carried. Thank you. Motion to adjourn from Councillor Santos and Councillor SAITO. All those in favor? Carried. Well done, and thanks to all. Okay.